Hey there, Melting Man 234 here. You're about to watch a re-edited version of the very first episode of Forgotten Media, where I talked about an obscure cartoon show called Sheep in the Big City. The original was taken down suddenly over copyright reasons, and because of that I've had to remove a lot of images and audio from this thing to try and make it more YouTube friendly, I guess. Oh well, at least this does give me an opportunity to talk about some new content that I didn't know of back then when I was working on it years ago. Now, if you're wondering why my voice sounds a bit different in this video, where I sound more slow and a bit slurry, that was because I was still recovering from jaw surgery at the time, so that's pretty much why I sounded very odd in those first 3 episodes of Forgotten Media. Anyway, here it is, the re-edited version of the first episode of Forgotten Media, with some bonus content at the end.
Hey everyone, Melting Man 234 here, and welcome to the first episode of Forgotten Media. This is a new series where I talk about movies, shows, characters, products, anything that nobody remembers anymore. Today's episode, I'll be talking about a forgotten Cartoon Network show called Sheep in the Big City. An interesting and funny cartoon show created by Mo Willems in November 4th of 2000. The show is about a sheep living in the big city while constantly being chased by a secret military organization. It starts off on a farm owned by a man named Farmer John, a man who loves farming so much his first name is Farmer. Anyway, they later introduce the main character, a sheep named Sheep. No surprise. Meanwhile, inside a top-secret military base, General Specific and his assistant Private Public are planning to capture Sheep to use in their sheep-powered ray gun. Sheep soon finds out about their plan and decides to leave the farm to keep his friends safe and head out to the big city to find a better life. While he's there, he enjoys living in the city away from his boring life at the farm, and manages to escape General Specific's plans on capturing him. As the series progressed, it had a lot of interesting characters. For the main cast, we have Sheep, who's your average sheep who enjoys bleating and eating and all that stuff. General Specific, a man who is small but very diabolical, and very dim-witted at that. He's more like those comedic villains you see on those old cartoon shows, kind of. Then there's Private Public, who is General Specific's loyal assistant. Next we have the Angry Scientist, who comes up with crazy gadgets that help the General try to capture Sheep. And he's pretty much considered to be a running gag, as everyone calls him the Mad Scientist, and he gets irritated and tries to remind them that his name is Angry Scientist. Then there's Farmer John, who is the most boring character on the show, since he just goes on and on about random stuff and nobody bothers listening to him. We have Ben Plotz, who is the narrator of the show and sometimes interacts with the characters, simulating the breaking the fourth wall gag. Swanky, who is a poodle, who is Sheep's love interest. Lady Richington, who is the owner of Swanky and has a flaming hatred for Sheep and constantly beats him up with her stainless steel wig. And little Lisa Rento, who's this mean, bratty little girl who enjoys torturing Sheep, like jumping on him, riding him, using him as a bat, you name it. We also have an interesting cast of minor characters like the Oxymoron spokesperson, who is this annoying salesman who tries to advertise his stuff from Oxymoron, the plot device, who is literally a plot device, and helps General Specific with plans on how to move the story forward, a talking ham sandwich who speaks in a more upper-class scientific kind of accent, and on one episode he becomes mayor of the big city. Then there's the Sombrero Brothers, who are two characters who try to be funny, but fail miserably at that. Jimmy McGame Game, who's a weird game show host that appears in weird games like Name That Name, I'll Answer the Questions Here, and others. And then there's Jay, who is this guy that appears when anybody reads or sees a sign. He'll say it out loud. The show would start off with a random advertising, then the screen would go fuzzy and the title theme would begin. Each episode is split into 3 chapters. The name of the chapters have very bad sheep puns. There was one time when Ben was very frustrated and decided to name the 3rd chapter some pun on the word sheep. Once the chapter is done, it shows a fake commercial or a skit before going into the commercial break. One of the skits involved General Specific and Private Public trying to make a rap song, but fail at trying to rhyme. Some of them are very random, like the zillion billion dollar question. Kids say the most hysterical things. And the most disturbing one, touched by a ninja. Once all 3 chapters are done, they end the show with a ranting Swede, a man from Sweden who always finds ways to rant, like He rants about meatballs or piano keys, answering machines, anything that pops into his head. This guy was full of energy and rage. You just couldn't help laugh at his funny performance. When the ranting Swede came on, you didn't know what to expect. The show is well known for breaking the fourth wall and using literal humor. One example is that when anyone uses the exclamation, "Great Scott," the Scotsman would pop out of nowhere and say, "Yes?" The show ran for 2 seasons, 27 episodes total, and every episode had its own unique storyline. Like, one episode involved General Specific trying to capture sheep, but gets distracted by a spinning plate performance. One episode involved General Specific finally capturing sheep, but the angry scientist doesn't put him in the sheep-powered ray gun because he didn't have it ready, because he thought they would never capture sheep due to it being so contrary to the setup of the show. One episode involved Ben coming out and saying the cast is sick, so they show a silent film full of ancestors from certain characters from the show. Jay's the only man in the audience and reads all of the title cards. One episode involved General Specific becoming a superhero, and another one when the General teams up with his character called Dr. Oh No 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 No, and he helps them capture sheep. Once they capture sheep, he decides to double-cross them and take over the secret military base. And to top it off, he plans to use an elephant in the sheep-powered ray gun, which means it'll give the machine enough power to destroy the world! Out of all the episodes that are in Sheep in the Big City, the weirdest one will have to be the last episode in Season 1. Now that the show has been explained, I'm sure you're wondering how it ended up being forgotten. Well, despite the positive feedback it got from critics and reviewers, the only downside is the show lacked a good amount of viewership. It's no surprise that only a rare group of people actually remember this show. And with that, Sheep in the Big City was cancelled on April 7th of 2002 and was never seen again. Nowadays, it's hard to find an episode of Sheep in the Big City. It never got a home video release, although the pilot episode managed to be featured as a bonus in a Powerpuff Girls DVD. At one point, all the episodes from Season 1, excluding the pilot, were available on iTunes before it was removed for unknown reasons. As for the internet, the only place where I could find all of the episodes is vbox7.com. Despite the website being in a different language, all the episodes are in English.
It's time for an update, because there's quite a bit of Sheep in the Big City content that I forgot to mention or didn't know of at the time. One such topic involves a cancelled episode that would have involved General Specific dealing with a relative who was always better than him, and a running joke where a private public is attacked by a crazy old lady. I found this from a blog that Mo Willems wrote, but I can't seem to find it anymore. The show had very little merchandising, mostly a single comic issue as part of Cartoon's comic series, and some toys that were sold at Subway. Man, I remember I used to have all of those. If I'd have known better, I should have kept them all rather than getting rid of them, because nowadays those toys are very rare and not easy to find on eBay or Amazon. The character Sheep has made a few cameos and references in other shows, mostly in Codename Kids Next Door, seeing as how Mo Willems was also involved with that series. There are some episodes where they feature some plush toys that resemble the character, but the most noticeable cameo would be in the episode Operation Graduates, where it features a scene where the delightful children from down the lane are turned into a flock of sheep, and one of them resembles the main character from Sheep in the Big City. Aside from that, Sheep was present during Cartoon Network's 20th anniversary, and he makes a very brief cameo in the OKKO episode Crossover Nexus. As I had mentioned before, Season 1 of the show was available on iTunes for a while until it was suddenly taken down, but there actually does exist a DVD that contains episodes of the show. Yeah, an actual DVD release. In Europe. And for how long I've been doing Forgotten Media, I've been starting to notice a trend. Obscure films and TV shows that get released onto DVD, but only in Europe and not in America. Like, seriously, what's the big deal with this regional exclusivity thing? Japan gets all the good stuff, and apparently Europe gets all the good obscure stuff. Now that I think about it, who even owns the rights to the show anyway? Mo Willems, Cartoon Network, Curious Pictures, Warner Brothers Television Distribution? Because it still saddens me that the series still hasn't gotten a complete series DVD or Blu-ray set, let alone not part of any official streaming service. I mean, come on, make a complete Season 1 and 2 DVD or Blu-ray release already. Put the show on Netflix or Hulu or something. The big cities need their sheep, damn it! I mean, sure, it's not the most super ultra special greatest show of all time, but I would appreciate it if there was some kind of official home media or streaming release of the show, and in America, rather than having to paw around on the internet to find episodes to watch. Anyway, that's all the new content I have to offer, so I'll just let my past self wrap things up.
In closing, Sheep in the Big City was a very funny and very witty show that will probably never see that kind of humor again in other shows. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing off. Hey everyone, Melting Man 234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Today's episode is about a video game that was never finished, known as American McGees Oz, an action-adventure platformer game with a horror fantasy atmosphere that was going to be released for the PC and Xbox. The game was created by American McGee himself, who was well known for helping out on the Doom and Quake series, along with creating his own line of video games, like American McGee's Alice and later Alice Madness Returns. From what I can gather, here's the scoop on this game. After the success of Alice, McGee decided to do a video game turning the land of Oz into a dark and twisted wasteland. The story acts like a prequel to the Oz series, and I'm sure it doesn't have any connections with Wicked. It turns out that Oz wasn't always a happy-go-lucky magical realm. It used to be a war zone with different sides at each other's throats. One day, a young teenage boy named Arthur is summoned to the land of Oz from Earth in turmoil, and he must destroy the evil to restore Oz back to normal. I was able to find very few gameplay footage and concept art for this game. For its locations, I'm sure you would travel to the north, south, east, and west regions of Oz and then later the Emerald City. Since the game was similar to Alice, several familiar characters were transformed into creepy-looking things. One of the Munchkins is dressed sort of like an engineer or in a steampunk style. The flying monkeys were featured in the game, probably giving a backstory on how they were created. Creatures called the Straw Golem would act as enemies. And I'm sure there is an idea where the player meets the Tin Man when he was human before he was entirely made of tin. Another interesting thing is that Jack Pumpkinhead was planned for the game, although I find it weird that it would be featured in the game, which is a prequel to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, even though Jack debuted in The Marvelous Land of Oz, which is a sequel to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Anyway, there was some concept art for the witches, and I'm sure they were going to have a big role in the game. These pictures show some concept art of certain locations of the game. The name of the locations are unknown. It looks like one of them is for the Jack Pumpkinhead character, one looks a bit like the Emerald City, and the others I'm not sure about. While the game was in its work-in-progress stage, they made action figures to promote the game's release in 2002, just like they did to McGee's Alice. I was able to get all three of them since they are rare nowadays. I'll talk more about those in another video. As the game was coming close to finishing up, Atari was facing financial difficulties, and American McGees Oz was cancelled in early 2004 and was never seen again. But American McGee didn't quit after that. He started looking for other video game companies that would help him finish it, but they all rejected the project. So he decided to give up. After that, McGee didn't mind that it was never finished. He learned that Oz was not an established franchise, which means it wouldn't be a success like Alice, and nobody wanted to take that risk. Although it's a shame that it was never finished, since there are still a lot of unanswered questions, like, how is the story going to end? What purpose would these characters have? Who's this guy? I'm guessing this could be the main character, and it might lead to the possibility that he would later become the Wizard of Oz, or maybe it was a resident of the Emerald City. I don't know, I'm just making up ideas as I go along. Well, I guess these questions will never be answered. So in closing, American McGee's Oz was an interesting idea, but I don't think it would have become a success like American McGee's Alice was. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing off. Hey everyone, Melting Man 234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Today's episode is about an old black and white cartoon character called Foxy, a cartoon fox created by Rudolph Ising, probably somewhere in the 1930s. As you look at Foxy, I bet you're saying, hey, he looks like a ripoff of Mickey Mouse. A lot of people say something like that when they first see Foxy, and it's no surprise. From what I can gather, Foxy was one of the many doodles Ising, Walt, and Up Iwerks drew after Disney lost the rights to Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. So after a mouse design was chosen, Ising took his fox character and started making some cartoons with him. Since Mickey and Foxy were both planned at the same year, it's hard to explain who ripped off who. There are some slight differences to Mickey and Foxy, such as the design of the shoes, ears, tail, voice, and personality, where Foxy is more aggressive than Mickey in his early years. Anyway, during his time, Foxy made 3 shorts. His first one was called Lady Play Your Mandolin, where it acts like Gallopin' Gacho and Cactus Kid combined. Smile Darn Ya Smile, where it's a little bit similar to the Oswald short Trolley Troubles, and its last short is surprisingly called One More Time, where Foxy is a policeman and he chases down a bunch of crooks. They also had another character with Foxy, which was a female fox known as Roxy, who was Foxy's love interest. So as you can tell, she looks a lot like Minnie Mouse. Each short has a song in the cartoon based off the title. It would usually be sung by Foxy or another character. As the cartoons were made, Foxy was pretty much acting a lot like Mickey. The way he moves, the way his personality was very close to the mouse. I wonder if anyone noticed the similarity back in 1930. The cartoons themselves had very interesting moments like, Smile Darn Ya Smile, a hippo lady is trying to squeeze into the trolley, and she's blurting out random gibberish. It was later revealed that she's saying, Susie heard one of those Atlantic bells. What do you think? Played backwards. In Play Your Mandolin, there's a scene where Foxy's horse gets drunk and starts hallucinating. This kind of stuff was common in the 1930s, where cartoons could get away with almost anything. And in One More Time, Roxy has an unnamed dog who is obviously being similar to Pluto. During 1932, Eising, the creator of Foxy, later left Warner Brothers and took Foxy and 2 more characters with him. Even though he got a new job at a new studio, Foxy would not make another screen appearance, and with that, Foxy was abandoned in 1932 and was never seen again. Although the 2 foxes were forgotten, one of their songs, Smile Darn Ya Smile, was featured in other medias like Who Framed Roger Rabbit and Batman, the Brave and the Bold. 6 decades later, Foxy and Roxy would rise again to be featured in one more cartoon, which was an episode from the Tiny Toons Adventure series. They appeared in the episode called Two-Tone Town, where Buster and Babs find a location full of forgotten Warner Brothers characters where Foxy and Roxy are some of them. There's also this interesting moment that I found that I'm not sure if this is related to Foxy. In the Fairly Odd Parents short episode called The Good Old Days, Timmy and his grandpappy along with Cosmo and Wanda enter the world of black and white cartoons. Cosmo and Wanda disguise themselves as cartoon foxes. Now I'm sure they were spoofing Mickey and Minnie on that one, but I always wondered if that was an interesting reference to Foxy and Roxy. Maybe I'm the only one who's seeing that. Although the 3 shorts were very old, they were able to get a home video release. Lady Play Your Mandolin is featured in the Looney Tunes Golden Collection Volume 1, while Smile Darn Ya Smile and One More Time were featured in the Looney Tunes Golden Collection Volume 6. As for the internet, all 3 shorts can be viewed on YouTube. Just type in the name of the episode and you'll be able to find it. So in closing, Foxy was a washed-up wannabe who will never see the light of day again. Well, that wraps up another episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing out. Hey everyone, Melting Man 234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Today we'll be looking at a handful of Mario and Donkey Kong games, as well as a Yoshi game that were cancelled and never finished. Let's start off with the Mario Artist games for the Nintendo 64 disk drive. During the N64 DD short life, they were originally going to make 8 games in the Mario Artist series before it was chopped in half. The games that weren't finished are Mario Artist Game Maker, Graphical Message Maker, Sound Maker, and Video Jockey Maker. Even though there isn't much info about these games, my guess is that Game Maker was going to be a game where you create your own levels, Graphical Message Maker would be something like a way to make fancy messages, Sound Maker would be a game where you just mess around with different sound clips, and Video Jockey is... I have no idea. Perhaps it was some way to make videos and share them with other disk drives or something like that. Next up, we have Mario Paint 64, another Nintendo 64 disk drive game. It was intended to be a sequel to Mario Paint for the Super NES, with some upgrades here and there, but since the disk drive was a big failure, it never saw the light of day. Next up, we have Super Mario 128. This one's pretty interesting. The only information that we know is that it's some game that has Mario and an army of mini Marios running around on a giant Monopoly board with blocks and other crap lying around. Well, the reason this game was never heard of again was that it was just a tech demo to show what the GameCube could handle. Several elements from the game would be incorporated into Zelda, Twilight Princess, and Mario Galaxy. After a while, Shigeru Miyamoto later revealed that Mario 128 was a very early blueprint for what would later become Pikmin. I always wondered if Mario 128 gave Nintendo some ideas for the Mario vs. Donkey Kong series. Next up is Super Mario 64 2, which was planned for the disc drive around 1999. That's right, Nintendo had plans to make a sequel to the classic Mario 64. Not much was given except that it was going to be for the N64 disc drive, and Luigi was planned to be featured since the game was going to be a multiplayer. Since the game was cancelled very early in development, some say that several elements of the game were moved on to Mario 64 DS, Mario Sunshine, and Mario Galaxy. Next are two Mario games called Super Mario FX and Super Mario RPG 2. These names would eventually become Mario 64 and Paper Mario. Next up is Super Mario's Wacky Worlds. This was a game planned for the Philips CDI. It featured Mario going around through different time eras, stopping on Koopas and so on. The game was considered to be a sequel to Super Mario World, but since the CDI had very poor sales, the game was cancelled, and Yoshi's Island became the official sequel to Mario World. I do find it odd that it was going to be a sequel to Super Mario World because if you just look at it, it looks more like a sequel to Mario's Time Machine. Next up, we have Mario Land for the Virtual Boy. The only thing we know about the story of the game is that Mario battles Wario, and that's pretty much it. Mario Land would have Mario jumping in and out of the background, trying to give it a 3D visual effect. It was also said that a 3D version of Mario Brothers was going to be featured. Even though the game was canned, the 3D Mario Brothers became Mario Class, also for the Virtual Boy. Now let's move on to some Donkey Kong games. First up is Return of Donkey Kong for the NES. It was announced in the official Nintendo's Player Guide in 1987 and was never mentioned again. Some say this was going to be a sequel to Donkey Kong, others say it was a prototype of Donkey Kong Classics, and others believe it was going to be a remake of the original game for the Famicom Disk System. This game still remains shrouded in mystery. Another cancelled game similar to that is Donkey Kong World. There's barely any information on the game. I only guess that it was either going to be similar to Mario World, or it was an early name for Donkey Kong 64, just like Ultra Donkey Kong. Next up is Donkey Kong no Angaku Asubi. In English, it's translated to Donkey Kong's Fun with Music for the NES back in 1983. There was going to be two games featured in this. The first one is a music quiz. This is a two-player option game where DK plays a tune and Mario and Pauline have to hit the right notes in the correct order. The other game is Donkey Band, where it's more of a music room creating different tunes here and there. It features DK on the guitar, DK Jr. playing the drums, Mario playing the piano, and Pauline is the main singer. A few years later, Nintendo released a game called Donkey Konga, along with a few sequels. Some people believe that DK's Fun with Music could be connected to the Donkey Konga series. Next up is Donkey Kong Coconut Crackers, a puzzle game for the Game Boy Advance made by Nintendo and Rare. Obviously, the reason this game was scrapped was that Microsoft bought Rare and pretty much ditched the project. However, Donkey Kong Coconut Crackers would be reworked into It's Mr. Pants for the Game Boy Advance. Next is Diddy Kong Diddy Kong Pilot. Sorry about that, Diddy was in the way on the title. Anyway, this game was also made for the Game Boy Advance and was intended to be a sequel to Diddy Kong Racing. It features Diddy and the gang in airplanes racing around through various tracks. It would also feature a new character named Redneck Kong, a hillbilly ape whose relationship to the Kong family is still unknown. However, since Microsoft bought Rare, the game was scrapped and also reworked into Banjo Pilot. And speaking of racing, the next cancelled game is also a racing game entitled Donkey Kong Racing for the GameCube. This was also going to be a sequel to Diddy Kong Racing. This was going to feature Donkey Kong, Diddy Kong, Tiny Kong, Kiddy Kong, Raj, and other characters in this racing game. It would feature some of the animal buddies as the rides, such as Ingard, Ellie, Zinger, and a couple of others. Even though it wasn't announced that it was cancelled, there was very little information on the game, so it was declared unofficially cancelled. Nowadays, the GameCube has finished making their line of games, so I'm sure Donkey Kong Racing will never see the light of day. And finally, we have the cancelled Yoshi game, where it was going to be a remake of Yoshi's Story for the Game Boy Advance. This game would feature new islands, new enemies, such as these creepy-looking bullet bills, and other stuff. But it never came to be because it was just a tech demo, which means it was made to show what the Game Boy Advance could handle during its time. So after all that hard work on these games, it's a shame that they were never completed. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing out. Hey everyone, Melting Man 234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Today we'll be looking at a few Crash Bandicoot action figures that were planned but never completed. But first, some history. Back in the day when Crash Bandicoot was becoming popular next to Mario and Sonic, Crash himself has had a variety of merchandise. A company named Resras, or something like that, were the ones who made the first Crash Bandicoot action figures. The figures themselves were pretty cool back then, where they had two series. The first series had characters from Crash 2, and Series 2 featured characters from Crash 3. Then there was going to be a Series 3 featuring Crash characters that they've missed, mostly characters from Crash 1. First up is Arctic Crash. Since we don't see this costume in any of the Crash games, obviously this is going to be something like an exclusive figure. The figure would come with a pair of snowshoes, goggles, aku, a crate, a relic, a base for the character, and Polar, the polar bear. This figure had a lot of accessories, and since Series 1 had crystals for every character, Series 2 had gems for every character, it looks like Series 3 would have relics for all the characters. Next up is Koala Kong. This would have been a very detailed figure showing the texture of the fur, the clothes, and so on. He would come with a crate, a relic, and a base. Not much accessories to this character. In fact, this figure is very similar to the Tiny the Tiger figure. Next up is a double figure pack containing Papu and Dr. Embryo. This pack would have come with Papu's staff, 2 beakers for a Brio, a crate and a relic, and some bases for the figures. It would have been cool to see the Brio figure finished. It looks very good. Next up is another double figure pack. This time it's Pinstripe Potaroo and Ripperoo. This is my favorite out of Series 3. For accessories, it would have Pinstripe's Tommy gun, a crate, a relic, and bases for the figures. And that's all for Series 3. They also made a few unreleased Crash figures featuring Tiny and Dingodile. The Dingodile figure is more detailed than its Series 2 counterpart. Of course, this figure shows the figure unfinished because they were displayed at a convention somewhere. And then we have the Tiny the Tiger figure, looking more like his Crash 3 counterpart. It shows him in his armor, as well as his Triton that he carries around. I'm not sure if these were planned for Series 3, but I think these were planned to be exclusive figures, like the Moto Crash and Coco figure, which is one of the rarest Crash figures out there. Since these figures were abandoned and never heard of again, some say that Series 3 and the other two were cancelled due to the figures from Series 1 and 2 being fragile. And it's no surprise because they are pretty fragile. I have a few Crash figures, and you can see some of them are already busticated. But overall, if these figures weren't that fragile, they would have been some very cool figures to play with. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing out. Hey everyone, Melting Man 234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Today's episode is about one of Nintendo's products that ended up as a failure, known as the Nintendo 64 Disk Drive, or N64DD for short. You might know a little bit about it since I mentioned it a few times in my Cancelled Mario Games episode, but this time I'll be going in depth on this one. This was a add-on system to the N64, which was announced at Nintendo Shashinkan Game Show event, now under the name Nintendo World, in 1995 in Japan. The system was planned to be released a bit early, but the date was pushed back to December 1st, 1999. Those of you who own an N64 know all the basics about it, such as the slot, the buttons, and the outlets to plug in the controllers. But if you look underneath it, you'll notice a little door underneath it. A lot of people in the US wondered what that was for, and that's where the disk drive comes in. It fits right into the little door, has some screws to keep it steady, and there you go, the N64 disk drive. Looks odd, doesn't it? It looks like a Nintendo 64 on top of an old VCR. This thing was released in Japan on a website called RAND.net. Since the system wasn't shown in stores that much, and the internet wasn't that big during the time, the system is pretty rare. It also has a few accessories such as a capture cassette, a keyboard, and a mouse to connect to the RAND.net. That's right, the disk drive was able to connect to a certain internet website. All of these would be used for a modem for the disk drive to connect to that website to discover other games for the system as well as purchasing them. As for the game themselves, they came in these little cases, and the cartridges were kind of shaped like those old floppy disks you put in computers, but they're a lot thicker. Some of the games were expansion packs, like the F-Zero one, for example, which would be added in some new things into the game that weren't in the original. As for the rest of the games, we have Doshin the Giant and the expansion pack version. People in the US will probably remember Doshin as one of the many trophies in Smash Bros. Melee. There's also a Japan Pro Golf Tour 64, which would pretty much be your typical game of golf with some stuff added in here and there. SimCity 64, which would be a Japan exclusive game to the SimCity series, and 4 Mario Artist games. Communication Kit allow people to connect to the RAND.net and share some of their artwork you created in that game. Paint Studio is a bit like Mario Paint, where you can draw your creations the way you want them to look and such. Polygon Studio is where you get to have some fun editing some 3D models here and there. And Town Studio, which was a small game where you get to create some animation and films with your own stuff. Several elements of the game would be incorporated into WarioWare. There is also a feature in one of the Mario Artist games, I think, where you can take a picture of somebody and the game morphs it into different expressions. This would later be tweaked up years later for the Nintendo 3DS. Now, I'm sure you're thinking I'm just showing a handful of games for the disk drive. Nope, that's about it. The disk drive only had 9 games. That's even shorter than what the Virtual Boy had, and that system only had 22 games. The disk drive was considered a commercial failure, probably because that it was released when the N64 was in its twilight days. It also had a poor sales rank, selling very limited consoles on the internet and not into the public's eye. The disk drive was going to be released in the US somewhere in 2000, but since the system failed so miserably, it never made it. Due to the short life of the disk drive, a huge amount of games that were intended for the console were either moved to the N64, moved to the GameCube, or scrapped entirely. I'll give you a few examples. A game called Banjo-Kazooie 2 was going to be for the disk drive, but it was later moved to the N64 and retitled Banjo-Tooie. A game called Cubivore Survival of the Fittest was moved to the GameCube, and a video game called Fire Emblem 64 was canned. However, several bits and pieces of the plot were later incorporated into other Fire Emblem games, so that way it wouldn't have that many plot holes like the Final Fantasy series had back then. The N64 disk drive was discontinued in 2001 and was never seen again. Back then, people in the US would never solve the mystery of what that door on the bottom of the N64 was made for until a few years later. Several disk drive systems can be found on eBay, but they go for extremely high prices there. So, bottom line, the N64 disk drive was pretty much a total failure. It was trying to expand the N64 style, but since the technology wasn't that advanced during its time, it just ended up as a total mishmash. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing out. Hey everyone, Melting Man 234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Today we'll be looking at an old cartoon show that didn't last very long, known as the Tomfoolery Show. This was a cartoon series that first aired on NBC TV in September 12, 1970. The show was created by the Rankin and Bass production, who you might remember them from their stop-motion holiday shorts like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Frosty the Snowman. Since nobody remembers the Tomfoolery Show, you might consider this as Rankin and Bass's least notable project. This was made in England by the Hallis and Batchelor Animation. The show contains nonsensical verses such as ones by Edward Lear, Ogden, Nash, Franken, Burgess, and Lewis Carroll. The show was known for its silly stuff and nonsense. With riddles, jokes, and silly things, it's all tomfoolery. The show had a cast of some wacky characters such as the enthusiastic elephant, who's a bit of a stout fellow and acts just like a showman, the fastidious fish, who walks around on stilts and usually talks in a gurgly voice, pretty much a fish out of water, the Yongy-Bongy Bo, whose head is larger than his body, the Scroobius Snake, who tries to tell funny jokes and riddles but accidentally ends up ruining it, and the Umbracious Umbrella Maker, who is a bit of a smart person. There's also this bird character who always whines about his life and all the nonsense and stuff like that. The music in the series were actually tunes that were used in the King Kong Show and Mad Monster Party. The show had some random titles that were just very weird, such as 3 Cheers for Rubber Bands and Succotash Has Identity Problems. Yeah, they were pretty random. Each episode usually had a song or a poem in it, but it usually had a lot of jokes. There was a running gag where this delivery boy is running around trying to deliver a large plan and shouting, "Plan for Mrs. Discobulus," or something like that. I'm sure some of the jokes were pretty funny back then. Nowadays they seem a bit corny. I'll show you a few of them.
Come, enthusiastic, and see my garden.
My goodness, what an unusual bush. What did you plant to get that?
What do you think? Birdseed. Hey, enthusiastic, I can never tell riddles.
Try this, Scrooby. What starts with an E and ends with an E and has one letter in it?
I don't know. What starts with an A and ends with an A and has one letter in it?
An envelope.
Oh, what a jolly riddle. I must try it out in one of my jokes. Hey, Fitzgigius.
Don't be so formal. Just call me by my nickname, Fitzgigius.
Okay. Listen, what starts with an A and ends with an A and you put it in a mailbox? Oh, I did it again! What's the difference between a red balloon and a matter baby?
What's the matter, baby?
Nothing. What's the matter with you? You fell for that one?
Very funny. But do you realize you have snoo all over you? Ugh, all that snoo.
Snoo? Snoo? What's snoo?
Not much. What's snoo with you?
Oh, somebody's gotta help me. Oh, young guy, you gotta help me. I haven't had a bite in 3 days. Whoa!
The show was intended for young viewers about the element of children's literature, but since a lot of people were confused with the show, it was hard to follow the segments here and there. The show was pretty much just a collection of bizarre jokes, riddles, and a cast of some crazy-looking characters. Since the Tomfoolery Show didn't catch on very good, after 17 episodes were made, the show ended in September 4th, 1971 and was never seen again. Nowadays, it's pretty hard to try and find an episode of the Tomfoolery Show. I don't think it was ever released on VHS or DVD, so who knows if anyone will be able to find all 17 episodes of the series. Although there is one episode that can be found on YouTube. Just type in Tomfoolery Show and you should be able to find it. In closing, the Tomfoolery Show was a pretty zany idea, but I guess it just didn't catch on very good, and who knows if Rankin and Bass regret making it. But to be honest, the show isn't that bad. It has some interesting stuff that were pretty good during its time. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing out. Hey everyone, Melting Man 234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Today we'll be looking at another one of Nintendo's forgotten consoles, known as the Game Boy Micro, a handheld system that was part of the Game Boy family that was released in September of 2005. The system is pretty small since it's about 4 inches wide, 2 inches tall, less than an inch deep, and weighs about 2.8 ounces.
It is so tiny!
Comparing it to a Game Boy Advance SP, it's really that small. It's pretty much the same size as an iPhone. As you can see, it has the usual control settings such as the D-pad, the L button, the R button, the A button, and the B button. The volume switches are now 2 buttons to adjust the sound of the system. The start and select buttons are underneath the system instead of being with the other buttons. This seems a bit like a bad idea. If you're playing the system on a table or sitting inside a moving car, there's a good chance you'll probably accidentally hit the start or select button, which can get very annoying. The 3 holes underneath the A and B buttons are the speakers. Unlike the other systems where they had a lot of holes for the speakers, this one only has 3. This could mean that you could get some very poor sound quality, but there's an option to plug in headphones so that way it would sound better. Just like the SP, the Micro comes with a backlight screen so that you can play it in the dark. It lasts up to 5 hours if the light's on the brightest setting, and 8 hours without it. The covers on the screen can be removable to switch it with other colored skins, since there is a variety of them. A few months later, Nintendo released a special edition of the Game Boy Micro celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Nintendo Entertainment System, aka the Famicom. So as you can tell, the skin is all designed in the Famicom style, and it is very hard to find nowadays. What makes this system interesting is that it also acts like an MP3, and it plays digital videos files. Just pop it in an SD card and you're all set. When it comes to the Game Boy genre, they had a couple of stuff for it, such as the e-reader, the printer, the camera, and so on. For the Micro, none of that stuff works on it. Instead, it only comes with its own charger that is slightly different than the SP one. But don't bother trying to use an SP charger on the Micro, because it won't work. Another problem with this system is that it's not backwards compatible, which means it can't play Game Boy or Game Boy Color games. I find it weird. The Game Boy Advance and SP were able to do that, so why not this one? When the system was released in the US, it didn't do so good with the sales. I remember seeing commercials for it, but never saw one in stores. That's because a lot of stores ignored it and didn't bother putting it on their shelves. If you tried to put the Game Boy Micro on the shelves of Walmart or Target or something like that, they would probably take one look at it and say, "Oh, that looks like one of those cheap LCD games you find at McDonald's or cereal boxes. There's no way we're letting that tiny piece of software into our stores." The Game Boy Micro failed to explain consumers of its value and just pushed aside like yesterday's paper. The Micro pretty much died in about a year and was never seen again. Even though the system was made in 2005, there isn't that many people who remember it since it was rarely seen in stores in the US. There's a ton of Game Boy Micros that can be found on eBay, usually up to 30 to 60 to 90 bucks. That is if you could find one that still works. After the Game Boy Micro came and went, this would be the end of the Game Boy systems as Nintendo would do some work on the Nintendo DS genre. Of course, nowadays they've finished with the DS consoles and are doing some work on the Nintendo 3DS. In closing, the Game Boy Micro was trying to revolutionize the Game Boy series, but a lot of people consider it as a big failure. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing out. Hey everyone, MeltingMan234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. First off, I would like to say that I am now accepting requests on Forgotten Media, so if you know something that has been forgotten and nobody talks about anymore, and you would like to see it on an episode of Forgotten Media, either comment me or PM me, and I'll see if I'll be able to do it. Anyway, today we'll be looking at a handful of cancelled Sonic games, so let's start off with Sister Sonic. This was actually going to be a localization of Popful Mail for the Sega CD that was announced somewhere in 1993. It would have the cast from the original game be replaced with Sonic characters, introducing Sonic's long-lost sister named Sister Sonic. However, due to a massive amount of hate mail, this idea was scrapped and localized the game as it was. It's funny that Sister Sonic was never revealed, although I find it weird that Sonic already has a sister named Sonya, but she only exists in the Sonic Underground universe. In the games and the comics, Sonic doesn't have a sister. Next up is Sonic Crackers. Yeah, sounds like a food product instead of a game. The game would feature Sonic and Tails running around through various levels while being banded together with some power rings. It would have the ability to pick up Tails and toss him to help solve puzzles and stuff like that. Even though the game was cancelled, most of the game's elements were incorporated into Knuckles Chaotix for the 32X. The only thing that survived from crackers are little bits of gameplay and a few pieces of music. Next up is a cancelled DS game that was announced at E3 of 2004. It was originally going to be the first DS Sonic game where you rub the touch screen to make Sonic go fast, touch the top of the screen that make him jump, and stuff like that. The cast of characters for the game are Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, Amy, Cream, Rouge, Shadow, and Blaze. Moving the touch screen back and forth reminds me of Wizard of Oz Beyond the Yellow Brick Road. Either way, it was simply a tech demo showing what the touchscreen was capable of doing back then, and Sonic Rush became the official first Sonic game for the DS. Next up is Sonic Jr. for the Sega Pico. This was going to be an educational game, showing most of the Sonic cast as their younger selves, so we would see the younger versions of Sonic, Tails, Robotnik, and so on. Now I'm sure some of you are thinking, a Sonic educational game? Well, that's a first. Well, Sonic has had his share of educational games back then, mostly for the Sega Pico. As for Sonic Jr., not much was known about the game. Some say the concept of Sonic Jr. never made it past the drawing board. Next up is Sonic Edusoft for the Sega Master System that was planned somewhere in 1991, right after Sonic made his big debut. This game was mostly have multiplications and other stuff for its education, as the game was targeted to 5-year-olds and stuff like that. Next up is Sonic Mars, which was originally going to be for the Sega Genesis, but was later moved to the 32X so that there would be enough room for the engine that they were working on at the time. This was a 3D game that was actually going to be based off of the Sonic Sat AM series, as some of these storyboards show Sally Acorn. Most of the stuff that survived are sketches of the bosses. A kraken, a snowman, a football player, a freaky looking clown. It was pretty much quite the freak show. The game would mostly have Sonic running around in 3D environments, collecting rings, bashing badniks, going to special stages, and the usual stuff. There's also this funny minigame where it has Sonic and Robotnik having a game of air hockey. There were a few reasons the game was cancelled. One was that the development team wasn't that interested in the project, one of Sega's workers, Michael Kasaka, left, and the fact that the 32X was a big failure. In 2007, 2 scripts were discovered that were written by Michael Kasaka and Don Goddard. These scripts can be found on sonicretro.org. Next up is Sonic 16-bit for the Genesis. This was another game that was based off of the Sat AM series. The most interesting thing about this game is the gameplay. In this level you have to sneak around in Robotropolis instead of speeding through levels. Sonic would have new abilities like the ring toss, a buzzsaw ability, and one where he shoots spikes all over the place. It would have been cool to play this game, but it never got completed. Next up, Sonic Ride. This was an unreleased arcade ride where people would sit in a seat given the feeling that they were running with Sonic through various levels, kind of like the Typhoon ride and seen in various theme parks and stuff like that. Nobody knows what the actual system was going to look like. The screen displaying some of its work was included as a bonus feature in Sonic Jam. Next up is Sonic the Hedgehog Amiga. This was another cancellation port that was going to be available for several computer systems, like the Spectrum, the Commodore 64, Amiga, and so on. The only slight difference here is the graphics are redrawn. Next up is an untitled Sonic game that was developed by the Sega Technical Institute. This photo is all that exists of the game, as it features Sonic in a 3D Green Hill zone. The design of the game is very similar to 3D Blast Labyrinth and Sega Sonic the Hedgehog, even though there isn't much info on this game. Next up is Sonic Saturn, obviously planned for the Sega Saturn, that was developed somewhere in 1995 or 1996. There's not much to talk about this game. It looks like Sonic would go running around through various levels collecting rings and balls. I don't know why you go and collect balls. Probably a reference to the balls you have to pick up in Sonic 3. Next up is Sonic Sports. This game was planned for the 32X in 1995. Even though the game was kept behind closed doors during its time, the only information that we got is that it was going to be very similar to Acme All-Stars with Sega characters. Some of the characters that were announced were Sonic, Tails, Ristar, and a few others. The games that were going to be in it were basketball, volleyball, soccer, and probably some others as well. Next up is Sonic the Hedgehog Extreme for the Xbox. This was a skateboarding game that would have Sonic going around through different levels performing moves. Shadow would serve as a battle opponent in the battle mode. While the game was scrapped, several people believe that Extreme helped influence Sega on the Sonic Riders series. It was later revealed by Takashi Lizuka at a Q&A session in 2011 that Sonic the Hedgehog Extreme has no connections to the Sonic Riders series. At last we come to our last game, Sonic Extreme for the Sega Saturn. This is probably the most interesting one out of the entire lot. It was first planned for the Genesis, then it got moved to the 32X, then it stayed on the Saturn. The story for the game, or at least one of them, a character named Professor Gazebo Bobowski and his daughter Tiara are the keeper of the 6 Rings of Order. Robotnik plans to steal them, so Gazubi summons Sonic to find the rings before Robotnik does. There were a lot of story ideas that were tossed around in this game, and I found a few of them. The first one, Sonic Twist, Sonic heads over to Tiara's kingdom for a date. Even though Sonic was running late, he decides to gather some Chaos Emeralds and form a necklace for her. Later, Robotnik sees him and tries to destroy him along the way so that he can get the Chaos Emeralds. The second story, Sonic Boom, Robotnik is infected with the Doom virus, so he passes it on to Sonic and orders him to find the cure or else Tiara will be thrown into a bed of nails. Sonic retrieves the antidote only to find out that the chains Tiara was attached to was also infected by the virus. Sonic would have to find her father so that he could help Tiara be cured from the virus. The third one, Sonic Doom, Robotnik cracks open the Master Emerald to attain some of its power, but it only releases the Doom virus instead. With the virus as his new weapon, Robotnik kidnaps Tiara, and of course Sonic comes in and saves her. Tiara later tells Sonic that it was Robotnik who released the virus, and must find her father to help find a way to destroy it. So who knows which one of these stories would become the final story. The cast of characters that were announced were Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, Knack, aka Fang, Robotnik, Metal Sonic, Gazubo, and Tiara. Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, and Tiara would be playable characters, having their own levels here and there. The character of Tiara was said to be a princess and have a love relationship with Sonic, obviously rivaling the Amy and Sally's love for Sonic. She would also carry around some sort of staff, probably representing her weapon. The game was pretty cool for its time, but since stuff wasn't working out well and time was running out, the game was cancelled. Probably another reason that it was cancelled was Tiara's gameplay. Here's a small bit of her own gameplay. While the game was still in development, they noticed that a video game called Clockwork Knight 2 was released, and they just realized that Tiara's gameplay was exactly like Clockwork Knight 2. As for the aftermath of its cancellation, several bits and pieces of gameplay and music can be found on YouTube and stuff. Sonic's model in Extreme was actually moved on to Sonic's schoolhouse, and even though Tiara will never appear in a Sonic game, she surprisingly makes a cameo in the Archie Sonic comic series. In the dreaded horrors of issue 134, where Sonic and Sally make their big breakup, Tiara can be seen in one of the crowd scenes on page 20. So after all that hard work on those games, it's a shame that some of them were never completed. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing out. Hey everyone, Melting Man 234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Today we'll be looking at an old abandoned television show which is considered to be the worst show that ever aired on Cartoon Network, known as Out of Jimmy's Head. This was a live-action / animated show that was created by Tim McKean and Adam Pava and premiered on Cartoon Network on September 14, 2007. So before I talk about the series, let's go back even further to the pilot episode that was actually a film called Reanimated that was created by the same people in December 8, 2006. The pilot was about some kid named Jimmy Roberts, played by Dominic Janes, who accidentally gets hit by a train and the only way to revive him is through the use of brain surgery. So they pull out a brain that used to belong to a famous cartoonist named Milt Appleday. Once the surgery is complete, Jimmy starts singing cartoon characters that were created by Milt Appleday, and they later explain that now that he has Milt's brain, Jimmy's the only guy who can see these cartoon wannabes. So after the movie was completed, they started to work on the TV series. So let's look at the cast of characters. Jimmy is your average schoolboy, except with the brain of a famous cartoonist and a whole bunch of other crap that makes this guy forgettable. His father, played by Bill Dyer, is the school's principal at Jimmy's school, or teacher, I can't remember which. His mother, played by Rachel Quentins, is an astronaut who usually goes off into space all day. In fact, she doesn't appear in the show that much, as far as I can remember. Then there's Yancy, played by Rhea Lando, is Jimmy's adopted sister. And yes, she's a frickin' alien that his mother found up in space one time. It's about as stupid as it can get. And then we have Jimmy's friend Robin and Craig, played by Tanasha Kachingu and John Etheridge II. Craig is more of the wacky one, while Robin is more of the calm and caring person. And then there's Sonny Appledale, played by Matt Cunson, or something like that. He is Milt Appleday's son, who lives in Jimmy's basement, planning to take his brain, saying with his father's brain, he'll become the greatest cartoonist and believes it'll help him rule the world.
Of course!
But the guy's a total joke. He always carries around a sack of money. The guy can't be taken too seriously, and his plans are just pathetic. I remember there was one where he had to dress up as a bear while he was holding on to his bag of money and riding a balloon. Yeah, Winnie the Pooh plus money bags equals a lousy excuse for a diabolical plan. And now for the cartoon characters. First we have Golly and Dolly Gopher, played by Carl Azwaku and Ellen Green. Sorry if I pronounced those names wrong. They were known as Appleday's best creations, with Golly being the star and Dolly being his female counterpart. Next is Croco, played by Brian Posen. He's pretty much the pea-brained alligator who usually gets himself into clumsy situations all the time. Next is Tux, played by Tom Kenny. He is the penguin who tells jokes, but they're usually corny and lame, since his catchphrase is Zing! And then there's this Pickle and Porcupine or Hedgehog character, who don't have any voices, but they do nothing all day but beat each other up. So I think the whole show was trying to teach kids the power of friendship, but it just didn't work, since the whole show is garbage. The jokes are stale, the characters are boring, Golly and his friends are cheap knockoffs of Mickey and the gang, while the two mute characters are Tom and Jerry wannabes. Another thing the show was known for was its false advertisement. It was said that this was going to be the first live-action/animated series on Cartoon Network, and obviously that was false. Space Ghost Coast to Coast was in fact the first live-action/animated series on Cartoon Network. Out of Jimmy's Head is the second one. I think one of the reasons the show suffered was that it was the only show on Cartoon Network that was affected by the 2007 Writers Guild of America strike. This was a moment when writers from various shows weren't getting the respect they needed and decided to go on strike. During this, Out of Jimmy's Head was put on hiatus when half of Season 1 was completed. While the strike died down, the show resumed its run, but it didn't last very long. With only one season and 20 episodes total, Out of Jimmy's Head was cancelled in May 2008 and was never seen again. Nowadays, it's a real challenge to find all 20 episodes of the series. The pilot was released on DVD, but none of the episodes got a home video release, at least not to my knowledge. As for the internet, I was only able to find the intro and the roller coaster scene from one of the episodes. I guess Cartoon Network is trying to erase the damage they caused with that show, and get people their respect back, but I don't think that's helping after the crap they've been spewing out lately. In closing, I might as well sum up the Out of Jimmy's Head in a nutshell. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media. So this is Melting Man 234 signing out. Hey everyone, Melting Man 234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Now I'm sure some of you are thinking, he's going to talk about the PSX? That's weird, that console isn't that forgotten. There's a lot of great games for that system. Why did you feature this in Forgotten Media? And the answer is, I didn't. The name PSX is known as an unofficial nickname for the PlayStation. The system is usually called the PS1 or just PlayStation. But thanks to Dude Sonica22, aka Rummy, I have found out there actually is a video game console that bears the name PSX, and here it is. This was a video game console that was created by Sony and was released in Japan on December 13th, 2003, a few years after they released the PS2.
This is probably the third biggest system I've seen next to the Atari 5200 and the Philips CDI. It weighs about 5.8 kilograms, so it's pretty heavy. The PSX was known for playing PlayStation, PS2, and even PS2 HDD games, so I'm sure you're wondering, why would you buy the system when the PS2 can do all that? Well, not only did it have those features, but it also had a DVR and other stuff like a software to do videos, music, and audio editing. The PSX was also known for introducing the Xerox Media Browser. This would later be included on the PS3 and PSP. The system itself would come with a console, along with a remote that is similar to the PS3 remote, but it doesn't come with a standard controller. You have to buy that separately, which I find it odd. The PSX had the usual buttons like the power and eject button, but it also came with a quit game button, which would quit the game that you were playing, bring you back to the menu, and eject the game. It also had a memory card slot, a few directional buttons, a USB port, and a memory stick. On the back, there's the usual slots and connectors for a PlayStation system, like the colored cables, the power slot, and so on. One thing that's weird about the PSX is that the slots for the PlayStation controller is on the back of it. I don't know why they did this, because it can get very annoying. You have to pull the system out to switch controllers. The only system I know that had that concept was the Philips CDI. For the menu, it had its usual stuff like the music menu, the photo menu, and so on. And it was very interesting, since this system was made before the PS3, so this was pretty much groundbreaking and very cool during its time back then. There are a lot of reasons the system was forgotten and considered a failure. When it came out, the price of it was very expensive, 79,000 yen for Japan. In the US, it would be translated to $835. When they made various versions of the console, like the PS3, the price expanded even more. The 7000 model was about 99,800 yen. That would mean it would equal to $100,079 in the US. Another thing I've heard of that the PSX is that the console barely works. A huge chunk of hardware at an extremely high price would rarely work at all, and I thought the Jaguar CD was the only console that had that problem. It turns out that the venting in that system was created so poorly that it tends to overheat very easily, and it might have caused your system to break down on you. This is even more worse than the notorious Red Ring of Death. Since the PSX barely works at all, it is very rare to find one that works, let alone find one period. The PSX is probably one of the rarest consoles out there, maybe even more rare than Chinaman 2 and King James Bible for the Game Boy combined. With so many people not that interested in the console, the system was not released outside of Japan, which means Europe and the US would not get the system. It pretty much shared the same fate as the Nintendo 64 disk drive. We all know how much of a failure that was, since I already talked about that in Forgotten Media. As for its discontinued moment, I'd say the PSX was probably discontinued somewhere in 2004, and after that it was never seen again. After Sony's little incident with the console, they eventually got back on track and created the PS3 as they fixed up all the problems the PSX had. There have been a few people that have come across this image and said, "Holy crap, it's the PS4, or the next generation of the PlayStation consoles." And of course this is false, since the system was already made, it was already sold, and the company already stopped making them. As I've said before, the system is very rare, and you would have to be lucky to find one that works at a reasonable price. They usually go up to $100 or $300. At least it's better than paying $135 or $1,079 for one game console. In closing, the PSX was a failure as the system barely worked, going for extremely high prices on its release, and it's pretty much known as the black sheep of the PlayStation family. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing out. Hey everyone, Melting Man 234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Today we'll be looking at 3 Sega handheld consoles, which are the Sega Game Gear, the Sega Mega Jet, and the Sega Nomad. So let's start off with the Game Gear. This was Sega's first handheld console that was in development in 1989 under the name Project Mercury. It was pretty common to have Sega's codenames being named after planets, just like how some of the Atari games are named after cats. The system was released in 1990 in Japan and 1991 in the US and Europe, and 1992 in Australia.
This was the third handheld system to have color, and it also has a start button, a power button, a D-pad, buttons 1 and 2, a speaker, volume switch, a place for headphones, and a place to plug in for a charger. On the back there's a slot to plug in the games, and 2 doors that show where the batteries go in. There were 390 games that were made for the system, like Coca-Cola Kid, Popeye, Beach Volleyball, Pack Attack, Tails Adventure, Sonic Triple Trouble, and many others that were good and bad. The Game Gear had its share of accessories, such as the TV tuner, which lets you watch TV on the Game Gear, the Super Wide Gear, which helps magnify the screen to make it larger, very similar to the Game Boy magnifier, a car adapter, which lets you charge it in the car, the Master Gear converter, which allows you to play games from the Sega Master System, the gear-to-gear cable, which allows you to plug in another Game Gear for 2-player mode, and the Power Pack and Battery Pack, which helps the Game Gear last longer. The system was in competition with the Nintendo Game Boy, and it sold very well, but the system itself has only one flaw, and that is the battery life. Since the system uses 6 AA batteries, they drain them real fast, and the Game Gear can only last up to 3 to 4 hours. That's about the same amount of time as the 3DS has. After its sales in stores and so on, the Game Gear was discontinued in early 1997, and as for its games, they were ported onto a few other media, such as Sonic Gems Collection and the Wii Virtual Console. Nowadays, it has been announced that the 3DS Virtual Console will feature Game Gear games. As for the system and the games, they can be found on eBay and such. Some of them are cheap, some of them are expensive, depending on how rare or in good condition they are. Next up is the Sega Mega Jet. This was a console that was only released in Japan in 1994, I think. It would play Mega Drive games, and the controller was exactly like a Genesis controller. The only difference with this one is that there is no screen, and you have to plug it in to make the TV work. What makes the system interesting is that this was only released in Japan Airlines, where you get to rent them and play them while you're on the plane to the next airport. The system has at least 4 games that were available at certain airlines, such as Super Monaco GP and Sonic the Hedgehog. But if you brought along your collection of Mega Drive games, then it'll work just fine. I'm not sure if they were able to take these home because nowadays the system is very rare and hard to find. And finally, we have the Sega Nomad, which was in development under the name Project Venus and was later released in the US in 1995. Instead of localizing the Mega Jet, we got the Nomad instead. It has all the same features as the Mega Jet does, the only difference is that it's bulkier, it has a color screen, and plays Genesis games. There was going to be a touchscreen feature to the Nomad, but since the technology was too expensive, which means it would raise the price of the system even more, the idea was scrapped. This idea would later be used for the Nintendo DS. Nomad has had a few issues, such as the battery life, which was similar to the Game Gear, and rechargeable batteries are not recommended due to some voltage problems. They later made a rechargeable battery pack to make up for the loss. Out of all the Genesis games that work on the Nomad, there's only one game that wouldn't work, and that was the X-Men for the Genesis. In the computer level where you have to literally reset your Genesis to continue on, it is impossible to do it on a Nomad since it doesn't have a reset button. The Nomad didn't earn enough support to continue on, and it soon bit the dust. The reason for that is that the Mega Drive, aka Genesis, was on its last leg as video game companies were already hard at work making the next generation of video games such as the Sega Saturn, the Nintendo 64, and the PlayStation. Nowadays, finding the Nomad is a lot similar to trying to find the Game Gear. Some of them are expensive, some of them are cheap, and it all depends on how rare they are or how in good condition they are. In closing, the Game Gear was a pretty cool system, the Mega Jet was a very interesting system when it came out, and the Nomad was a nice way to play Genesis games on the go. That is, if it wasn't for the short battery life. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing out. Hey everyone, Melting Man 234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Today we'll be looking at an old forgotten video game character known as Gex the Gecko, an anthropomorphic wisecracking gecko that was usually known as the mascot for Crystal Dynamics. The character had 3 games, and a comedian named Donna Gold provided the voice of Gex for all 3 games in the US. So let's start off with the first game, simply known as Gex, a 2D platformer game that was released somewhere in 1994. The game was available for the 3DO, PC, PlayStation, and the Sega Saturn. The story for the game was that Gex and his family lived in Maui, Hawaii, and his father works for NASA. One day, his mother is informed that his father was killed in a rocket explosion. As his family mourns his loss, Gex keeps his feelings bottled up and starts watching television to get over the tragic death of his father. 3 weeks later, Gex becomes addicted to television, becoming more of a couch potato. After his family tried numerous times to try and get Gex to stop watching TV, the family decides to move to Econ, California, leaving the television behind. Gex later runs away from his family, and after living in the streets for months, by good fortune, he inherits his uncle's money and uses it to buy a mansion and the largest television set. One day, while enjoying his TV, he swallows a fly that was actually a transmitter, and he gets pulled into the TV by a massive claw. It turns out the claw belongs to Rez, an evil overlord who plans to take over the TV media and uses Gex as his mascot. Now Gex must travel to various worlds in the media dimension and destroy Rez and get back home. The goal in the game is to collect TV remotes and other stuff to unlock the next level and later fight Rez. Each level has its own style of levels, such as the Cemetery, the New Toontown, Jungle Isle, Kung Fu-ville, and Rezopolis. Gex has a couple of neat moves, such as the tail whip, his tongue to help grab power-ups, and the ability to climb on walls just like a real gecko. Gex has been known for making many references to TV medias and pop culture, with his wisecracking attitude. The game was pretty much a classic and became the best game for the 3DO of 1995. Next up is Gex Enter the Gecko, or Gex 64, or simply called Gex 2, a 3D platformer that was released in 1998 for the PlayStation, N64, PC, and the Game Boy Color. In this sequel, Gex has returned to spending his days watching television, until 2 government agents arrive at his place to report that Rez is back and plans to take over the TV industry once again. And it's up to Gex to head back to the media dimension once again to stop Rez's evil plans. The goal was to collect TV remotes and other stuff to proceed to the next level, just like in the first game. The game would feature Gex going around through various levels from Toon TV to Screen TV and other media-themed levels. What makes this game interesting is that Gex changes costumes to fit the mood of the environment that he's in. Gex has his usual abilities, such as the tail whipping and his tongue attack, and climbing up walls, even though the climbing wall ability only works on certain areas. The power-ups have been cut down for some odd reasons, since there were a lot of cool power-ups in the first game. But overall, it was a good game that tossed Gex from 2D into the 3D of gaming. One of the interesting things about this is that once you defeat Rez, he announces that he is Gex's father by saying he fell into a scrap heap attempting to get free cable. It's still debatable if this is true or not. Most people think it was a spoof of Star Wars, but others say that Rez actually is Gex's father. Yes, that's one question we'll never find the answer to. And finally, there's Gex 3, Undercover Gecko, that was released in 1999 for the PlayStation, N64, and the Game Boy Color. The story for this game is that Rez has returned yet again and has kidnapped Agent Extra, played by Marlise Andrada. And it's up to Gex to save her and defeat Rez once and for all. Unlike the other games, where they usually had more of a colorful look, this game kicks it up a notch, and the design of the game is given more of a darker look, but still keeping with the Gex style, and it's the first Gex game to get a teen rating for the PlayStation because of its sexual jokes. This was later toned down for the N64 and Game Boy Color ports. The game had its usual tail whip, tongue, and climbing wall ability, just like the last one, and this time giving new power-ups such as the ability to glide. The levels kept on their TV media purpose, and there's even one level that features stuff from anime cartoons back then, and I think that's pretty cool. Out of the entire trilogy, Gex 3 has been known for being the best-selling Gex game, even though there's one guy who has a flaming hatred for it. During the release of Gex 3, there was going to be a line of action figures that were planned to be made by Resource, the same company who made the Crash Bandicoot figures, and for some odd reason, none of the figures were released. Gex has had a few merchandising, mostly strategy guides, and even a book that teaches you how to draw Gex and the gang. Even though Gex only has 3 games, he surprisingly appears as an unlockable character in Hot Shot Golf 2. After a couple of years after Gex 3, Crystal Dynamics had plans to make a 4th Gex game for the PlayStation 2, but for some unknown reason, the game was cancelled and never made it. These 2 pieces of concept art are all that exist of Gex 4.
It's a real shame that Gex was going to be coming back, but since the 4th game was cancelled, Gex will probably never see the light of day again. As for the Gex games nowadays, sometimes it's a real challenge to find all 3 of them. Recently, Gex 1 and 3 have been released for the PlayStation Network, and there are plans to release Gex 2 on the PSN on August 24th, 2011. Let's just hope nobody hacks into the PSN system again. In closing, Gex had a lot of successful games, and he's pretty much the video game mascot that doesn't earn the respect that he deserves. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing out. Hey everyone, MeltingMan234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Today we'll be looking at a couple of Sonic figures that were cancelled and never made, but first a little bit of history. Since Sonic was a big star next to Mario in the video game industry, he had his share of massive amounts of merchandise, from bobbleheads to lunchboxes to McDonald's toys and more. Several companies have made various action figures of Sonic the Hedgehog and the gang, so let's take a look at the action figures that were never made. During Resource's time making action figures, they've made some based off of Sonic Adventure. Series 1 had Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles, and Series 2 had Sonic, Amy, Big, and Gamma. It turns out they had plans for a Series 3, but it was never finished. The characters that were planned were Super Sonic, Shadow the Hedgehog, Rouge the Bat, and Dr. Robotnik, obviously them being based off of Sonic Adventure 2. So far, I was able to find the prototypes of Shadow and Rouge as they would look more like their video game counterparts. I was unable to find the prototypes of Robotnik and Super Sonic, but by judging by the other series, obviously Series 3 would include bases for the characters and a ring with a holder for it. They might have come with their own accessories like Series 2 did, but I'm not sure. Resource also had plans of making a 12-inch figure of Knuckles since they already made 2 versions of Sonic, but the idea was scrapped as the company was going out of business. If these figures were made, then they would become rare nowadays like all the other Sonic figures made by Resource. Even though the idea for Series 3 was canned, Jazzwares and Toy Island would make various action figures of Super Sonic, Robotnik, and Shadow. Toy Island made 1 Rouge figure, and it is very rare and hard to find nowadays. At least I've heard that Jazzwares is planning to make a new action figure of Rouge. And speaking of Jazzwares, that company has been known for being the current company in making new Sonic figures, but they too have had a few rejected ideas. One figure that was scrapped by Jazzwares was a metal Sonic figure painted in silver. Obviously, it was going to be a fancy exclusive figure, since Sonic has had his share of different color schemes that were exclusive figures, pretty much in like gold and silver and all that stuff. And even Espio had his own special edition. I guess they thought the figure wasn't that interesting and just scrapped it. Out of all the small lot of cancelled figures, the most interesting one was that Jazzwares had plans in making a Metal Sonic 3.0 action figure. Now, if you don't know who this character is, I'll give you the rundown. Metal Sonic 3.0 was an alternate version of Metal Sonic created by Eggman Nega, aka Dr. Nega, and made his first appearance in Sonic Rivals 2, and he hasn't appeared in a Sonic game for a long time. Since he hasn't been seen in another game after that, it seems like 3.0 was becoming another one of the forgotten Sonic characters. Well, anyway, the idea for the Metal Sonic 3.0 action figure was it was going to use the same model they used for the Metal Sonic figure, and just paint it in different colors, like instead of all blue and bits of yellow, it'd be all black and bits of yellow. Well, anyway, Sega rejected the idea of a Metal Sonic 3.0 figure, and so it was never made. To me, I kind of wish the figure would have been made, since it does look a bit cool, even if he is another one of those forgotten characters, but hey, I'm the only guy around here that shows some sympathy for those forgotten and unloved characters. I mean, Egg Robo just gotten his own action figure, so why not this guy? Maybe it's because a lot of people treat Metal Sonic 3.0 as just a lousy recolor of Metal Sonic. Oh well, all the same, after all that hard work and planning, it's a shame these figures were never made. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing out.
everyone, MeltyMan234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Today we'll be looking at a handful of video game consoles that were never completed, and boy, this one's gonna be a real doozy. First up is the Atari 2700. This was a system that was planned to be released in 1981. This is going to be the next system after the Atari 2600, and it would feature wireless controllers, and the designs were smooth and fluent. The only downside is that the remotes were very sensitive, that they can work at over a radius of 1,000 feet. This would mean it would affect other Atari 2700 systems, as well as other remote control devices like TV remotes and garage doors. They tried fixing the problem, making the controls bulky and hard to control to fix it, but it just didn't make the cut. The design of the system would later be used for the Atari 5200. Next up is the Atari 5100, or the Atari 5200 Junior. This is going to be a smaller port of the Atari 5200, as some of us know how big that thing is. It had the usual design and such. The only difference is that the little slot that keeps the controllers is gone, and it uses a standard TV switch box instead of the 4-port automatic switch box thingy. I'm not sure if the system might have helped iron out all the bugs the controllers had, but since the Atari 5200 wasn't received that well, its junior port never hit the shelves in stores. Next up is the Atari Cosmos. Work on the system started in 1978. The system was made to look something like an old mini arcade machine where they placed 2 holographic images over an LED screen to give it a 3D image, and the system would run on an AC adapter instead of batteries. 9 games were planned for the system, such as Asteroids, Basketball, Dodge'em, Football, Outlaw, Roadrunner, Sea Battle, Space Invaders, and Superman. The system was displayed at a New York toy fair in 1981. It wasn't received well. Even though the system was a package and ready for shipping to go to stores and such, Atari pretty much pulled the plug and canceled the whole thing entirely, as they thought it was too much of a risk to release it after the criticism they got. Only 5 prototypes are known to exist and are extremely rare. Next up is the Atari Game Brain. This was an unreleased dedicated video game console that was planned to be released in 1977. The system was known for 10 games, most of them being based off of Pong. The system was intended to clear out the CPUs in the other unsold consoles, but when a prototype was already in progress, dedicated consoles were already becoming obsolete against the programmable ROMs that were made, and so the console was scrapped. Only 3 Game Brain consoles and 5 prototype cartridges are known to exist. Next up is the Atari Panther. This is going to be a 32-bit system that was scheduled to be released in 1991. The system would have 3 chips, a Motorola 68000 running it, a sound processor called Otis, 32 sound channels displaying 8,192 colors from an 8-bit palette of 262,144 colors, and support 65,535 sprites of any size simulator. Quite a lot of numbers, ain't it? So far, there has been 3 games that were planned for the system: Crescent Galaxy, Radian, and Cybermorph. These games were later moved to the Jaguar. The system was scrapped as Atari decided to focus their attention on the Atari Jaguar. And speaking of the Jaguar, Atari had plans of making a sequel to the system called the Atari Jaguar 2. There's not much information as its unfinished hardware is all that exists. Judging by the looks of it, it looked like it would have its own line of games and might work on Jaguar games. I'm not sure if it was going to work on the Jaguar CD, but I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't, since that system never works. Another Jaguar system that was cancelled was the Atari Jaguar Duo. This weird machine was a dual system playing both Jaguar and Jaguar CD games instead of the add-ons. Since the Jaguar CD failed, the Duo was never released. It's a bit of a shame, really, since the system combined 2 different Jaguar games. They might have ironed out all of the bugs that the CD add-on had. Next up is the Sega Neptune. This was going to be a 2-in-1 system that was planned to be released in 1994 and 1995, going up for $200. Since the 32X failed so miserably, Sega decided to make a system that would play Genesis and 32X games without the confusing cables and connectors and such. If you'd watch my Cancelled Sonic Games video, you'll notice the page I used for the Sonic Sports was a small advertisement for the Neptune, so they were pretty advertising it very small. But when a prototype was already finished, Sega was ready to release the Sega Saturn, and they decided to scrap the Neptune as they felt not many people would be interested. Several prototypes exist, and so far, there is at least one that actually works. Next up is the Sega VR. This was going to be a fancy add-on that was announced in 1991. It is very similar to the Virtual Boy and the Sega 3D glasses. Since it only got to the prototype stage, it was last seen at a computer show in 1993 and was never mentioned again in 1994. Sega canceled the system as they felt that the system was so real, people would move around and damage themselves and have headaches and such while using the thing. Next up is the Super NES CD add-on. Not much to talk about it since it was going to be an add-on to the Super NES with its own line of games. The story behind it, or at least what I've heard, is that Nintendo and Philips had plans for a CD add-on for the Super NES, and it never made it. Philips later took the idea and did it themselves, and the CDI was born. Also, Sony tried to do the same thing with Nintendo, and it wasn't made, and so Sony went on their own and created the PlayStation. Next up is the Action Game Master. Probably the weirdest console I've ever seen. It looks like somebody took two PlayStation controllers, connected them to a football, then glued an iPod on top of it. The system was made by Active Enterprise, a company who makes unlicensed video games like the dreaded horrors of Action 52 and Cheetah 2. The Action Game Master was planned to be able to play NES, Super NES, Genesis, and PC games with the use of an adapter or some sort. The system would have its own line of games that one of them was announced was Cheetah 3, but since Active pretty much stopped making stuff in 1994, it was never finished. A few reasons why the console was never completed, let alone worked on, was that it was too bulky and would be extremely expensive, going up for $500. Next up's the Magnavox Odyssey 3. This was going to be a system that would have a real mechanical keyboard and built-in joystick hold for the dual joysticks. It was displayed at a Consumer Electronics Show in 1983, and since the video game crash was already in effect, it's no surprise that it never released and only a few prototypes exist. Next up is the Ultravision Arcade System. This was a computer console that was announced in 1983. The slogan for the system was, "It's a game, a computer, a color TV." Yeah, had it all, didn't it? It would have had the standard 10 color in the games and controlled by 16 directional joysticks with 2 buttons, and the system was portable as it would run on AC or DC power. It would have its own line of games, but it would also support the ColecoVision and Atari 2600 games. The system was very expensive, as it was $999, and since it was announced during the video game crash of 1983, it's no surprise that it was never completed. Next up is the Tattoo Wow Wow. Pretty weird name for a console, ain't it? It was made to play ports of Tattoo arcade games as well as download games from satellite transmissions. The console was presented at a Tokyo Game Show in 1992 and was never seen again after that. Reasons for its cancellation are unknown. Next up, the Nano Gear. This was an interesting concept as it was a handheld that could play PC games and create your own games. Even though this was planned in 2003, it never made it off the drawing board, probably because the technology wasn't that advanced yet. Next up is the Extreme Game Player. This was a handheld system that was announced in 2005 and 2006, and was intended to be a follow-up to the Game Park 32. There were 3 versions. One was the standard type, one was a smaller version known as the XGP Mini, and the other was the XGP Kids, which was very similar to the Game Park 32. But since the company announced bankruptcy in 2007, the consoles were never made. Next up is the L600, made by a company called Injima, or whatever you pronounce that name, that was founded by John Gildred in 2000 and was shut down in April of 2001. The L600 was a computer console that could play CD player, DVD player, web browser, have a MP3 storage device, and a video recorder. It was pretty interesting, but since the release date of the system was during the time the Xbox, PlayStation 2, and GameCube were already in competition, it got scrapped. I'm sure they canceled the L600 because they felt it would just be pushed aside by the other 3 consoles that were already released. Next up is the Ape Extreme, made by Apex Digital. The system was going to be something like a personal gaming console with a keyboard, mouse, game controller, and a remote control. It would have a database called Drop and Play, the ability to store computer games on a hard drive, and play DVDs, VCD, audio CDs, MP3s, slideshows, and internet radio. It was displayed at a Consumer Electronics Show in January of 2004, and the company canceled the idea near the end of that year. Next up is the Connex Multi-System, that was planned to be released in winter of 1990. This was a video game system developed by Connex and Flare, and was intended to make the multi-system 16-bit with other interesting features. The console itself was like those fancy add-on steering wheels on certain consoles. Things weren't going too well with the system as the company faced many problems when Connex ran out of cash to release the system. I wouldn't be surprised if there are a few prototypes that exist. Next is the Panasonic Mark II, made by the same company who made the 3DO. Through certain prototypes, it was declared more powerful than the Nintendo 64. Of course, the Dreamcast would top all of them. Since the system had a long load time, there were only 5 games made for it. The system was cancelled in 1997 as the company didn't want to compete against the PlayStation. Next is the Phantom, an interesting console that was requested by SonicFan14. The system was supposedly going to be a console capable of playing any PC game from the past or future. It was seen in action at a Electronic Entertainment Expo in 2004. During development, the Phantom was delayed so much as the company was already working on the Phantom Lapboard, so after a while, I think they canceled the project in 2006 and decided to focus more on the Lapboard. And finally, we have a video game console named Jungle. This was Panasonic's first attempt at a handheld console that was announced in October of 2010. It was able to play online games on the go, and the games that were announced were Stellar Dawn, RuneScape, and Battlestar Galactica Online. The system was going to be released in mid-2011, but Panasonic canceled the system in March of 2011 due to changes in the market. Well, there you have it. After all that hard work on certain systems that were cool, interesting, or just plain random, it's a bit of a shame that most of them were never completed. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing out. Hey everyone, Melting Man 234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Today's episode is about a very funny cartoon show that didn't last very long, known as This was an animated series that was created by Doug Longdale and premiered on Disney Channel January 23rd, 2004. The story for the series is that the King and Queen of Udrugoth have left to destroy all the evil in the world, and their daughter, Princess Candy, is in charge while they're gone. While she's in command, the other members of the royal family, Dave, Fang, Oswich, Faffy, and Lula, are responsible to help protect their land from the forces of evil that threaten to destroy them and take over the kingdom of Udrugoth. The show takes place during the Middle Ages, but also makes gags on products that already exist in the future. The cast of characters are pretty cool and hilarious. Dave the Barbarian, he's big, strong, powerful,
Please don't hurt me! Please
and
don't,
not what
please,
you would
please,
expect.
please.
Dave is pretty much the exact opposite of a usual barbarian. Instead of plundering villages, he makes pancakes. Instead of battling fierce monsters, he would run like a coward. Instead of a brave barbarian battle cry, it would come out something like this.
Look out, people! Here I come!
He also has this interesting catchphrase that he usually uses when he's scared or surprised.
Pajabbers! 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 Pajabbers!
Yep, pretty weird response, ain't it? Assisting Dave is Lula, the enchanted sword. She's more of a comedic relief as she's a loudmouth who most of the time makes sarcastic remarks and nags all the time.
Lovely. I'm strapped to someone with the IQ of a garden snail.
Then there's Princess Candy, who's pretty much your average teenager who would rather enjoy shopping and hanging out with her friends instead of ruling a kingdom. But when you start messing with her too much, you'd better watch your back.
Don't mess with the princess.
Well, most of the time anyway. Then there's Fang, Dave's pet monkey. I mean Dave's youngest sister. Unlike Dave, Fang is more fearless and is always ready to face anyone that threatens their land like a real barbarian, even though she's the smallest out of the bunch. Fang was known for being a running gag as everyone mistakes her as a monkey by her looks. Then there's their uncle, Oswich, an old wizard who mostly enjoys eating and being lazy. He can cast magic spells, but they usually don't turn out so well, like this one for example.
I accidentally gravity reversed myself this morning. And if I go outside, I'll fall into the sky. I'm good as long as I keep a nice sturdy ceiling under me. Nice ceiling, nice ceiling.
Then we have Faffy, who is Dave's pet dragon that breathes lightning. He pretty much does nothing, as he's a dim-witted dragon who enjoys licking his nostrils and other stuff. The series had a cast of interesting secondary characters. Sometimes they'll have a scene where Dave and the gang are able to talk to their parents through a magical device of some sort.
Are you alright? Sure, why do you ask? Oh, the chains! Well, when you fight evil, sometimes you're gonna get put in a fiendish death trap from which you have to heroically escape at the last instant.
Then there's Mrs. Gert Bogmelon, who's a shop owner that sells junk and doesn't take no for an answer.
Are you looking for something, darling?
Yeah,
We got that.
There's the narrator, who usually tells the story and makes the characters do things that they don't want to do.
I have to hurry back or I'll miss the harvest banquet.
But first, Dave must find Chuckles, the silly piggy, and thrash the living daylights out of him.
Why would I want
Need to get some action in this story, boyo.
Good point.
And then there's Twinkle, the Marble Horse, probably the weirdest character on this show.
I had that dream again. The one where I do terrible things to penguins with the croquet mallet.
Oh, we definitely gotta get you out of that stable more.
At first you'd think that's Christopher Walken voicing him, but it's actually voiced by a guy named Jeff Bennett, who's been known for doing various voice impersonations and has done a lot of voice work in his career. Of course, the show had a cast of some interesting villains, such as Quasmere, the giant Naga wielding the power of flaming loogies, and has a case of short-term memory loss.
I shall have my pistachios, my corduroy sports coat, my revenge. I shall have my revenge.
There's Mal Squando, who's an evil wizard and is Ozwitch's rival, who obviously uses magic to try and take over Udragoth. Ermoplotz, princess of the land of Hydragoth, once dated Dave as they both shared things in common, but they had to break up since Dave's a hero and Ermoplotz is a villain, and she's still not pleasant about that. So she and her mother plot on taking over Udragoth and humiliating Dave at the same time. And then we have this guy.
I am Ned Frischman, man of tomorrow.
He's some nerd who lives in the year 1994 and is able to travel to Udragoth by the use of a time zipper. But the most evil villain that has ever been known to be the main villain in this series is...
The Dark Lord.
Chuckles, the silly piggy!
Well, he's not much of the scary kind. Nevertheless, Chuckles is a pretty evil and hilarious villain, and it's always fun to watch him as he plans numerous attempts to destroy Dave the Barbarian.
You shall perish beneath the might of my mighty mightiness!
The character is pretty much a combination of Dr. Robotnik and General Specific. He's pretty much one of those comedic villains you enjoy watching all the time. As for the series itself, each episode would usually have 2 stories in one episode, and one episode had a 2-part story in it. The stories themselves are pretty unique, and sometimes they can get very random, which is pretty funny. The show was known for its comedic characters and times when they tend to break the fourth wall a lot. Dave the Barbarian was such a great show that it got a lot of good reviews and positive feedback. The show actually won an Annie Award for Best Storyboarding in an Animated Television Production of 2005 for one of their episodes. But despite all of this, the show did have a few flaws. Despite all the reviews that it was given, the show suffered a lot of low ratings. On top of that, the episodes were released out of order. I'm not sure if this is common in animated series, but it just kind of annoys me. Episode 3 is actually Episode 11, Episode 9 is actually Episode 2, and Episode 7 is actually Episode 1, which makes sense since it introduces Chuckles, but since the episodes are out of order, Chuckles was already known before that. The only episodes that stay in their proper order is Episodes 5, 12, 13, and 14. One thing that really puzzles me is the episode called A Pig Story is supposed to be the real final episode, even though it's place number 19. But then it says that episode Fiends and Family and Plunderball are the last episodes of the series. I can't tell if this is how they were, or maybe they accidentally switched them around, but I have no idea. But anyway, after 21 episodes were made, Dave the Barbarian was put on hiatus for a while, and then they later decided to cancel the show on January 22nd, 2005, and it was never seen again after that.
Ow! My toe! Ow! Ow! Ow!
To my knowledge, the show didn't get a home video release, which is a bit of a shame, but if they can make a complete series of the show on DVD, it would be nice if they put them in the correct order they should be.
As for the internet, all the episodes can be found on YouTube thanks to certain YouTubers that have uploaded them. In closing, Dave the Barbarian is a funny and enjoyable show that should have lasted longer. It really does a good job with the story, jokes, and wonderful characters to make the series great. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing out. Hey everyone, MeltingMan234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Today we'll be looking at another short-lived cartoon show that was actually pretty good, known as Robotomy. This was requested by Kevin the King 99, and since this was the first time I heard it, I thought, I'm sure this was a show made back in like 1990s or early 2000s, but then I later found out it was actually around in 2010. That's pretty interesting. Anyway, Robotomy was an interesting and insane cartoon show created by Michael Buckley and Joe Dizze that was announced in August 13th, 2010, and premiered on Cartoon Network on October 25th, 2010. The series was developed after a long list of rejected ideas and was put in and out of production because they were changing executives at the time. I still find it interesting how it was made after a series of unacceptable ideas. Either the guy who was coming up with those was being real lazy and stupid, or maybe it was because Cartoon Network's being real strict about the ideas. Anyway, the story of the series takes place in a world called Insanius, populated by insane robots who go around killing each other, while the two main characters, Thrasher and Blastus, try to survive their high school year with all this crap going on. I still find it interesting how these robots get brutally damaged in every way possible, and yet they always come back all fixed up and such. Kind of reminds me of John the Hedgehog from the International Moron Patrol series, how he always gets himself killed and always comes back. But the cast of characters for the show, obviously Thrasher and Blastus are the main characters. They look like Deco and Boko, as if somebody drew them in a steampunk style. Thrasher is the tall guy who is nervous and always cautious, while Blastus is the more outgoing but sensitive guy who just wants to be popular. There's Weenus, who is the nerd with a massive arm, and has moments when his geeky voice sounds like an evil overlord, so he tends to have that kind of moment where it switches different voices here and there. There's Dreadnought, who's a strict teacher that enjoys bashing his students while giving out tests and homework. He kind of reminds me of the Grumble from Real Monsters. There's Megawatt, who's the most popular and richest robot in Harrius Apocalypse High. He's a bit dim-witted, but has been known to get the ladies' attention for his upgrades and such. There's Mammy, who's another popular student in the high school, and she's more of a snob. Thrasher has a crush on her and tries numerous attempts to make her notice him. And then there's Thunderbite, who's the principal of the school. He's actually sweet and kind and doesn't brutally attack the robots like all the others. He's pretty cool. Kind of reminds me of a creepy version of Octobot, even though nobody remembers that guy. The series itself had some interesting episodes. One episode had Thrasher and Blastus get countless upgrades to become popular. One episode had them go through puberty and have to pass a certain test to become men. One episode had them drinking some weird tonic to become more powerful and destructible. And one episode had them babysitting some baby robots, but then when they let a Tickle Me Psycho doll escape from their sights, the two robots accidentally start a war. What's interesting about the episode is that besides the fact that the toy is a spoof of Tickle Me Elmo, it's pretty cool that the creature is actually voiced by Gilbert Gottfried, who most people know him as the voice of Iago from Aladdin. The show was insane, violent, and pretty funny in its own way. The show itself is something like Super Jail, and the art style is pretty nice. It really brings back memories of whatever happened to Robot Jones. Sadly, the show didn't last long because of production costs, and people in foreign countries weren't that interested in the series. Even though the first season was going to have 12 episodes, they were able to finish 10. At least the episodes are put in the proper order of the timeline and such. The series was later cancelled in January 24th, 2011 and was never seen again. Due to its short life, it'll probably never get a home video release since there aren't that many episodes on the series. As for the internet, all the episodes can be found on YouTube that have been uploaded by a certain YouTuber. The only problem is that some of the episodes don't have any audio, and I have no idea why it's that. Hopefully someone can upload them with audio and such. I recently found out that all 10 episodes from the show can be found on iTunes for a good deal, so I find that pretty interesting how iTunes has all the episodes from that short-lived series. So in closing, Robotomy was a pretty crazy and cool show that didn't get the respect it deserves, and it felt like it was just pushed aside like yesterday's paper. There are a couple of people that say the show is terrible and such, but to be honest, it's not the worst show on Cartoon Network. Believe me, I've seen worse. Even though the series was cancelled in early 2011, and right now it's coming close to the year 2012, I consider the show to be freshly forgotten. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing out. Hey everyone, MeltyMan234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Today we'll be looking at an old forgotten system known as the VideoNow. This was a video player that was distributed by Hasbro through Tiger Electronics and was released in 2003. It was aimed at children who wanted to watch their favorite shows on the go, and so they made the VideoNow. I remember seeing commercials that they advertised for it as their slogan was, "I want my video now!" So anyway, as you can tell, the VideoNow looks like a CD player with a more bigger screen. In fact, I think it's the same size as a Game Boy Micro screen. The system would run on PVD discs, which are slightly smaller than a usual CD, and had very little skip protection. The system had an eject button, a play, stop, skip button, as well as a volume switch, a place to plug in headphones, and it takes 3 AA batteries to work. The VideoNow can hold up to about 30 minutes of video and play about 15 frames per second. All the video data is stored on the left audio channel, and all the mono audio is stored on the right channel. It had a big list of shows that were available, such as Blue's Clues, SpongeBob, Scooby-Doo, and a whole bunch of others. They made an editing software for the system that was known as the VideoNow Media Wizard, which allows you to create your own PVDs and such. He also made the VCam Now, which was a camera that was used for shooting VideoNow footage. The one weird thing about the VideoNow was that they first released it in black and white, and this was during 2003. I'm not sure why they did that because, hey, it ain't the 1960s anymore. My only guess is that they didn't have enough storage for the color, but I have no idea. They later fixed the problem when they made the VideoNow Color, which is the same as the original, except that it plays in color. They've also made a few models of the system, such as the VideoNow Junior, that was distributed by Playschool, and it was aimed for the younger ones. They made the PVDs for the system more flexible, so that kids wouldn't scratch or break the regular ones. There was also the VideoNow XP, which is something like a mini laptop, and that it has a larger screen, it plays in color, and includes controls for the games that were featured on the system. And finally, there was the VideoNow Color FX, which is the same as the VideoNow Color, except it's given more of a translucent design. They've also made VideoNows in different colors or in special designs and such. I remember one time I was reading Archie Sonic issue number 137, and I noticed on the back they were advertising a VideoNow Kool-Aid edition, and I'm sure that thing is probably rare nowadays. Besides the VideoNow, they also made one that was aimed for the preteen market called the Chat Now. This was a combination of a walkie-talkie and a mobile phone. It included digital photography, text messaging, and receiving transmissions using a Family Radio Service UHF radio band. As the years went by, the technology was getting better and the iPods and laptop DVDs were coming in. The VideoNow just seemed like it was becoming obsolete compared to the other systems. And as for its discontinued moment, I think it was during 2005 or 2006, but I could be wrong, but after they stopped making the VideoNow, it was never seen again after that. Nowadays, the VideoNow isn't that hard to find. Most of the time, you'll find a lot of those on eBay. They are pretty cheap, going for at least $10 or $20. Some of them can be very expensive depending on how rare or in good condition they are, or if it's a huge collection of VideoNow related products. Nowadays, people think that the VideoNow is a hunk of junk compared to the other systems, but during its time in 2003, it was a pretty cool system, playing videos on the go and such. In closing, the VideoNow is a very decent system back in 2003, even though nowadays the VideoNow is pretty much out of date compared to the iPods and the digital downloads and all that stuff. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing out. Hey everyone, MeltingMan234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Today we'll be looking at an old forgotten video game engine known as the Build Engine. This was an engine that was usually used to make first-person shooter games like the Doom engine, and usually created games for the PC. It all began way back in June of 1992. A man named Ken Silverman was watching his brother Alan playing a new game that was called Wolfenstein 3D. Ken was so interested by the game that he wanted to make his own that was originally titled Walkin'. It was a 3D labyrinth walking around collecting lightning bolts and gumdrops and shooting them at people. Not much to talk about it since it's merely just a test project. After a while, Ken changed the name to Ken's Labyrinth. The game was given an update with its graphics and design. Ken was able to release the game to the internet with the help of a company named Advanced Systems. On January of 1993, when Ken was still 17 during the time, his father signed a marketing agreement with Epic Mega Games for Ken's Labyrinth. While staying true to the source, they made some changes to the game, mostly giving it a creepy feel like exploring a dungeon full of ghouls and spiders and stuff. While this was going on, Ken was already in development making a new 3D engine that would support angled walls and began testing in it on March of 1993. While getting used to its new design and detail the engine ran on, Ken decided to think of a good name for it. He didn't want to call it the Construction Engine, as he felt that it had too many syllables. So after a while going through some different names, he finally picked one out, and so the Build Engine was born. Ken was able to make a very decent demo of the engine's functions in June of 1993, after talking to a man named John Carmack, a worker at id Software, who later decided to rewrite his engine, giving it some updates. During February of 1994, Ken was already making adjustments and some tune-ups to the engine, giving it more texture. Most of the upgrades contain wall and floor sprites, translucent textures, creating slopes, camera movement, network support, HI-res modes, creating layers of platforming, as well as some voxel graphics, or however you pronounce that. Ken was working with APOG, however you pronounce that weird name, but /3D Realms while he was making these upgrades. The company decided to use the engine for their games. They also licensed the Build Engine to other companies such as Capstone, Dogbone Software, Robotomy Software, and others. Some of the games are pretty good, while some of them not so much. On June 20th, 2000, Ken Silverman released the Build Engine source code, which allowed certain games to be ported onto other systems with the help of various companies and such. The Build Engine had a bit of a mixed reaction. Some like it, some hate it, but overall, it was a pretty decent engine that they were able to use back then. But as time went by with all the technology increasing and such, it seemed like the Build Engine was just out of date and just vanished from existence. During the Build Engine's time, they were able to make 13 games that were utilizing the Build Engine's features, and there was at least 3 games that were planned but never released. Besides the first-person view and so on, I'm sure you're wondering, what were these games like that they utilize the Build Engine? Well, I'll tell you all about it next time. Check in for part 2 and we'll be looking at all the video games that utilize the Build Engine. I know this episode seems short, but I'll tell you, I've got a lot to say about those Build Engine games in part 2. In my last episode, I talked about the Build Engine. I know the first part was pretty short, but I just wanted to focus on the history of it. So now, let's move on to the video games that utilized its features. First up is Witch Haven, a violent fantasy game that was developed by Capstone Software and was released by Entrecorp Entertainment on October of 1995. The story of the game is that an evil witch has sent the land of Starzia into eternal darkness, and a brave knight named Grondoval must travel to Witch Haven and defeat the witch. Besides its first-person view, it does contain some RPG elements such as experience points and such. It contains a multiplayer mode in a deathmatch style, and it says it's up to 16 competitors, which I find that kind of interesting.
There are 10 weapons and a couple of magic spells in the game that have their own purposes. Gameplay mostly consists of hand-to-hand combat mode. As the game was released, the game was praised for its graphics but was criticized for its bad AIs and poor level designs. Even though the game didn't get much praise, there's actually a sequel called Witch Haven 2 Blood Vengeance that was released in May 6, 1996. The game picks up where the first game left off, where Grondoval is told that an ancient female golden dragon named Ixthib, however you pronounce that name, has arrived to avenge her sister's death, who is obviously the witch from the first game, and has sent her army of demons along with Argonthinish, that guy's clan to kidnap Grondoval's princess Elizabeth and some of its citizens. Now it's up to Grondoval to save the captives and defeat the evil forces. Yeah, I know I'm saying those names wrong, but you have to bear with me here. Its gameplay is similar to the first one, with a few upgrades, such as the ability to wield 2 weapons and have a shield out in a non-weapon hand. Although the reviews were a bit better this time, people were criticizing the cinematics, its poor AIs, and think that the sequel was just mostly a rushed-out expansion pack instead of a sequel. Surprisingly, there was going to be a Witch Haven 3, but since Intercore went bankrupt and Capstone went out of business, the idea was scrapped pretty quickly. Next up is William Shatner's Tech War, based off the novels, which later became a TV series and eventually got its own game that was released in 1995. The story is that you are an ex-cop who's been hired to stop a clan who's producing a type of drug called tech and must stop the disease before a population of people become crackheads and such. William Shatner himself makes an appearance as the narrator. You can go around and shoot people and pick up ammo for certain purposes. The game can get a little complicated, such as its map layout and the annoying AIs. Some of it doesn't make sense, but I believe it makes sense to the people who've read the novels or watched the series or something like that, but overall, not one of the best games on the build engine. Next up, Legend of the Seven Paladins, that was planned to be released around in 1994. It looked like the game would take place in China and going around attacking people, and the 7 paladins might resemble like people you have to save or kill or certain items you need to collect or something along the lines like that. Not much is known as the game was going to be developed by an Asian company, but since they were having communication problems, they were using the build engine illegally. Although the game was completed, it was never released. Maybe it's because the company knew about it and pulled the plug on it before they got sued. Next up is Power Slave, or Exhumid in Europe, that was released somewhere in 1996. You're pretty much this guy going around an ancient Egyptian tomb, slaying mummies and searching for evil forces that has taken your city. You can get weapons and relics to help you out through the game, and it also contains various secrets, such as unlocking some awards and so on. It's pretty interesting. Next up, Blood, a horror shooter game which was released in 1997. It takes place somewhere in World War II, where a man named Caleb is part of a group called The Chosen, who has been killed and is brought back to life as he searches for vengeance and the answers of what happened. This game was known for being the first-person shooter to feature alternate and secondary attacks. The game is a split into 4 episodes, which the expansion pack, known as Blood Plasma Pack, has 6 episodes. The game was pretty violent for its gore and such, but it was a pretty good game. And it even got its own sequel, Blood 2, The Chosen. Next up, Shadow Warrior. This was released in 1997, as the story is that you're a man named Lo Wang quitting his job after finding out that his boss, Master Zilla, is planning to take control of Japan with his demon creatures. Zilla later sends his creatures to kill Lo's master, and so Lo Wang sets off to avenge his master's death and defeat Zilla. Gameplay usually has fighting and puzzle solving, weapons where you have either throwing stars, a samurai sword, a gun, and an introduction of the sticky bomb that would later become popular in the Halo series. But I still find it interesting. Have you ever seen a samurai carrying around a gun? I don't know if you've seen that, but it's kind of a first for me. There were a few expansion packs, such as the Twin Dragons, which reveals that Lo has a twin brother, and Watten Destruction, which expands the levels and such. The other one was going to be called Deadly Kiss, but it was never released. But either way, the game was pretty good. Next up, probably the most famous one of them all, Duke Nukem 3D. This game was released somewhere in 1996 and acted as a sequel to Duke Nukem 2, as Duke finds out that Los Angeles is invaded by aliens and it's up to him to stop the havoc. The gameplay is pretty simple, shooting the living crap out of aliens. The game was known for its pornography and violence, which started a bit of controversy, but The game was pretty cool, and it had a lot of expansion packs, such as the Atomic Edition, Extreme Nuclear Winter, and so on. Duke Nukem 3D was one of the best games utilizing the build engine's functions, and it can be played on Xbox Live Arcade nowadays. 15 years later, it finally gotten a sequel known as Duke Nukem Forever, which has received mixed opinions from the fans and critics and such. Next up, Fate. This was another game that was cancelled somewhere in October of 1996. The game was going to have you jumping between maps, weapons, and secondary fire modes, and intelligent enemies. The game looks cool, but since Intercom went bankrupt, the game was never finished, and a demo of the game is all that exists of Fate. Another cancelled game is Corridor 8 Galactico Wars, which is going to be a sequel to Corridor 7, as the game would have 6 episodes of 10 maps each. But before a prototype was made, the game was cancelled as Intercom went out of business. The source code for the game is all that exists of Corridor 8. Next up is NAM, or Napalm, that was released on July 31st, 1998. It's pretty much your typical war game, as it's every man for himself and kill or be killed. It's similar to Duke Nukem 3D, except that there is no grenades. The game itself is another one of those games that has mixed opinions from people and such. Next up, Redneck Rampage. Probably the weirdest yet hilarious game for the build engine. The story for the game is that two brothers named Leonard and Bubba, who live out in Hickston, Arkansas, must save their prize pig Bessie from an evil alien invasion that plans on ruling the world. The gameplay has you going around shooting the living daylights out of aliens, collecting supplies and power-ups, and just going insane. Although the game has received mixed opinions, it's pretty fun to watch all this chaos going on. It had a few expansion packs, like the Cuss Edition, which expands the foul language, the Early Years, which includes a 8 multiplayer deathmatch, and Suckin' Grits on Route 66. It also spawned a sequel named Redneck Rampage Rise Again, and a spin-off Redneck Deer Huntin'. Next up is World War II GI, pretty much known as the last game to utilize the build engine, as it was released in 1999. As the title says, the game pretty much takes place within World War II environments. Just like Tech War, this game is not that good. The difficulties can get crazy and the graphics are very poor. For a game that was released around 1999, it looks like the game was for like Super NES times and such. But anyway, the game sucks. And if you thought that was bad, I pretty much saved the worst for last, which is Extreme Paint Brawl, pretty much known as the worst video game to utilize the build engine, and was released somewhere in October 20th, 1989. It's pretty much a paintball game on a PC with so many problems. First off, the AIs are so busted and purely random. They usually run to the nearest wall, do moonwalks, or have perfect aim. So, no matter how good you're at dodging, you're always gonna get hit no matter what. Graphics are stale, its gameplay is broken, and I'll tell ya, it's almost as worse than Bubsy 3D. Well, okay, maybe not that bad. Surprisingly, it gotten 3 sequels, Extreme Paint Brawl 2, 3, and 4, and I'm sure they all suck. Extreme Paint Brawl would be known for being one of the worst video games for the build engine, and one of the worst video games of all time. So, there's a collection of build engine games for you. Some good, some bad, but overall, it was kind of decent, kind of a mixed opinion kind of deal. Even though there are some people that say they're just Doom clones and stuff like that, but, oh well. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Belting Man 234 signing out.
Bubsy, 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 Bobcat!
What could possibly go wrong?
Hey everyone, Melting Man 234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Today we'll be looking at a video game character that is considered to be the worst video game mascot ever created, known as Bubsy the Bobcat. An anthropomorphic bobcat created by Michael Berlin, and was the mascot to a video game company called Accolade, or something like that. So let's get this over with and start off with Bubsy's first game called Bubsy and Claws Encounters of the Fur Kind, that was released for the Super NES and Sega Genesis on May of 1993. The story for the game is that a group of aliens called the Woolies have come to Bubsy's world to steal all the balls of yarn, and it's up to Bubsy to stop them. Most of the gameplay borrows, or most likely steals, ideas from Sonic the Hedgehog, such as they both run fast and they pass a sign that has their face on it as they reach the end of the goal. The game has 5 main worlds with 3 levels each, and each of the levels' names have very bad puns consisting of cat puns. Bubsy starts off with 9 lives, collecting yarn balls, collecting t-shirts that give him certain abilities, and his abilities usually have him jumping on enemies, running extremely fast, and gliding, which makes no sense because Bubsy doesn't have wings and he doesn't have a loose shirt, so I have no idea how a freaking Bobcat is able to glide like that. The Bubsy games have been known for their level designs, as it's drawn out like a massive maze and you have no idea where you're going. Bubsy is voiced by Brian Silva, and the characters tend to get very annoying, as his catchphrase is, "What could possibly go wrong?" The game has been known for its cartoony art style and such, but overall, Bubsy's first game has been known for being somewhat decent or not that good, depending on who's reviewing it. A few years later, they later ported the game to Windows 95 and January 4th, 1996 under the name Super Bubsy. It was like the original, except it has redrawn graphics, new game elements, and has the Bubsy cartoon as a bonus. Yep, that's right, Bubsy Bobcat had his own cartoon series that was planned to be in 1993. The pilot was made, simply titled, "What Could Possibly Go Wrong?" The story is about Bubsy's nephews coming over to Bubsy's house for their birthday, as they watch the news and find out some guy who creates a helmet that turns your imagination into reality. Yeah, a device like that kind of reminds me of the Sega VR. So, while this is going on, an evil cat lady plans on using the helmet to make her wishes come true and sends her henchmen Buzz and Sid to steal it. But it later turns out that Bubsy's nephews got it first, so it's up to Bubsy and its weak sidekick Arnold to get the helmet back. In this cartoon, Bubsy is voiced by Rob Paulsen, who has done a lot of voice work in his career, such as voicing Yakko Warner and Pinky in the Animaniacs series. And his voice as Bubsy is even more annoying than the other one. After the pilot was aired, it got massive amounts of negative reviews and low ratings, so ideas for a Bubsy cartoon series were cancelled immediately. The episode can still be viewed on YouTube, but let me tell you, it's pretty bland. Next up, Bubsy 2, that was released for the Super NES, Genesis, and Game Boy on April 3rd, 1994. The story for this game is that after Bubsy has saved the world from the Woolies, Bubsy takes his nephews to a historical theme park called the Amazatorium, created by a guy named Oinker P. Ham, who later turns out to be the villain, as the park's technology is stealing actual historical events. So it's up to Bubsy and Arnold to go through various levels based off of historical events, save the nephews, and defeat Oinker. Rob voices Bubsy again, while the game is the same as the original, except there are a few new things added in, such as Bubsy collecting trading cards to buy items, the iron balls are now switched to spiral balls, and there are a few new weapons, such as a diver's suit, a Nerf gun, smart bombs, and a slingshot. Some of the characters from the pilot episode appear in the game, mostly Bubsy's nephews, Arnold, Buzz, and Sid. The game still contained its stupid puns, bonus levels, and that cartoony feel. The sequel wasn't that well received, at least that's what I've heard of it. But yeah, it's just pretty cheesy, especially with the villain, Oinker P. Ham. Like, yeah, sounds more cheesier than Crispy Bacon from Banjo-Tooie. Alright, moving on. Next up is Bubsy and Fractured Furry Tales, that was released for the Atari Jaguar on December 15th, 1994. It seems like this game is more of the forgotten Bubsy game, since when people talk about Bubsy, they barely mention this one. So anyways, you can tell Bubsy is thrown into a world of fairy tales, where he must save Mother Goose and restore order to the magical realms by defeating the Mad Hatter from Alice in Wonderland, the Giant from Jack and the Beanstalk, the Genie from Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, a giant lobster from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and Hansel and Gretel from Hansel and Gretel. So it's pretty much the same compared to gameplay-wise. The arm balls are now balls with the exclamation mark on it. There are level codes, not much power-ups, a bonus game based off of Snow White, and once again, Rob voices Bubsy one more time. This game is pretty weird, like the giant lobster in the 20,000 Leagues level. It's like, what's up with that? Isn't it supposed to be the giant squid that attacks the Nautilus in Captain Nemo? And I don't know why they had to pick Hansel and Gretel as the final boss. Whatever happened to the wish that tried to eat him anyway? Oh well, this game had some interesting music, but the rest of the game is just bleh. So, since it's obviously only for a console that was a big disappointment, it's no surprise why this game is more of the forgotten Bubsy game. Alright, one more, and boys, this one's gonna be a real doozy. Bubsy 3D, or Bubsy in Forbidden Planet, that was released for the PlayStation on October 31st, 1996. It was also going to be featured on the Sega Saturn, but it was scrapped pretty quickly. The one thing that really puzzles me is that the game got a Gold X award, as some of the text says, Bubsy 3D climbs back on the top, and some stupid crap like that. How it got an award like that, I'll never know. Anyway, the story for the game is that the Woolies are back and have captured Bubsy and taking him back to their planet Rayon. But Bubsy escapes, lands on their planet anyway, and must defeat the two queens and collect rocket pieces to get back home. And since this has been said thousands of times, I'll say it again. Bubsy 3D has been known for being the worst PlayStation game. The game is known for its horrible puns, poor level design, and Bubsy's voice. This time he's voiced by Lena Minella, if I pronounce that right, and boy is it annoying as heck. The man behind this disaster is Michael Berlin. He felt that Bubsy 2 almost killed the franchise and wanted to make a 3D Bubsy game, even though he had no experience with the controls or any of the tools in making the 3D graphics and such. And speaking of the graphics, they are pretty terrible. Some of the levels look unfinished, while a lot of them look something like you'd see in a prototype or a beta file. Now, I know this was during 1996 and getting new with the technology, but come on, they could have done at least better than this. As for its controls, it's like playing a badly programmed tank game. That's all I can say about the controls in a nutshell for this one. This time, instead of yarn balls, you get to collect atoms, or whatever they are, to earn points, and they also serve as an attack, as Bubsy can pick them up and throw them at something. There is also a good and a bad ending, depending on if you collect all the rocket pieces or not, but let me tell you, they both suck. The only good thing about this game is that there's an option to mute Bubsy's voice, and I'll bet anyone who's played this game has immediately muted Bubsy when they found out about the options menu. So, while the game was late in development, the team pretty much rushed it to get it done, and it turned out to be a horrible game. It pretty much shared the same fate as Sonic Next Gen, as that game was also rushed because the bloody fanbrats were being real impatient about it. So, once Bubsy 3D came, it pretty much killed Bubsy by dropping an atom bomb on him. And so when the 2000s came along, Bubsy was chucked into the rejected world and was never seen again. Nowadays, some of the Bubsy games can be cheap, but sometimes they are expensive, depending on how rare or in good condition they are. Even though Bubsy was such a flop, there are some people that actually like the guy, mostly because they think he's cute and such. And I'll have to admit, if they gave Bubsy a massive attitude adjustment, he might have been a likable character. Oh well. In closing, Bubsy was a failure of a mascot, as his games contain bad puns, annoying voices, confusing levels, and there is no way they'll make another Bubsy game after the damage they've caused. If I was trapped in a room in which the only way to get out is to either play all 4 Bubsy games, or be forced to watch all 20 episodes of Out of Jimmy's Head, I'd go with Bubsy. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing out. Hey everyone, MiltyMan234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Now, as some of you can tell, I love The Nightmare Before Christmas, such a classic film and one of Tim Burton's memorable films, and my channel name is actually based off of one of the citizens of Halloween Town. With such a great movie, there's an explosion of merchandising from dolls to sculptures to snow globes, ornaments, and so on. Of course, they had their share of making action figures, as most people remember the company NECA making a lot of NBC merchandise. Of course, nowadays, we have June Planning as the current company making the action figures. NECA has made 6 series of action figures of the characters and things based off of the film. They also made some box sets like the Oogie vs. Jack one, and some exclusive figures like Pirate Jack and Vampire Jack. While NECA was still doing some of the merchandising on NBC, and had just finished Series 6 of their action figure line, they had plans for a Series 7, but it was cancelled because NECA didn't renew their license to make more. So today, we'll be looking at a small lot of Nightmare Before Christmas action figures that were made by NECA but never released. First up is another Sally figure. This is actually the 3rd time they made one of these. The first one in the series had Sally with a few accessories, such as the black cat, deadly nightshade, and some small bottles she gives to Jack when he's still pondering about Christmas. In Series 3, they made a more sad-looking Sally that would come with her sewing machine and a picture of Jack in his Santa outfit. In Series 7, she was going to have her apron, a cauldron, and stove, obviously representing her kitchen stuff she uses to make food for Dr. Finkelstein. I'm sure they would have some other accessories added in, maybe like the Frog's Breath can, or Worm's War, since they already used Deadly Nightshade. Even though the figure was scrapped, surprisingly June Planning made their version of the concept, and I always wondered if they knew they were actually finishing a cancelled project. Next up is Oogie Boogie, which is actually his first time being part of the series, since he was only available in one of the box sets they made. This Oogie would come with his normal colors, which is his brownish color, not his green one, and it would have a feature where you can rip off his arm, revealing the bugs inside. It looks like he might have come with a few accessories like a present and the card in the background, but I'm not sure if they was going to have any more, but the figure is pretty big. Even though the figure wasn't made, its prototype can be seen on the back of Series 6 figures. And finally, we have a fancy double figure pack that would feature another Santa Jack, a Santa Sally, which is pretty interesting, various presents that are mostly from Christmas Town, and the giant snake. It's pretty interesting seeing Sally in a Santa outfit because they actually made a Santa Sally figure a while back as more of a fancy special edition figure, and I'm sure that's pretty rare. But it's a bit of a shame that this double figure pack wasn't made. It looked pretty cool. Since the NBC action figure series NECA made usually had 4 in each series, this one only has 3. So it still remains a mystery whether NECA had plans of making a 4th one in Series 7. After all that hard work and planning, it's a bit of a shame that these figures weren't finished. They would have been cool. Well, I was going to end the episode here, but before I do, I have a special treat. While I was doing some research on the canceled action figures, I stumbled upon some forgotten history of the Disney theme parks. Apparently, there was going to be a Nightmare Before Christmas attraction ride that was going to be in Disneyland and was in its storyboard sketches during 1996, I think. It would have you riding on Jack's sled, gliding through the air, looking at familiar scenes from the film. Obviously, the idea of flying sleds in the ride were based off of the Peter Pan ride. It does a good job recreating scenes from the film as its artwork was done by Christopher Merritt. The one weird thing about the ride is that it was going to be placed next to It's a Small World ride, and that seems a bit like a bad idea. Because on one side we have this cute and happy-go-lucky ride, and on the other side is this dark and scary-looking ride. It's like showing the light and dark side of Disney. Since Disney and Burton owned certain halves of the film during the time, Disney needed Burton's approval to get the ride in full motion. When the team showed Burton the idea in its sketches, he rejected the idea as he feared that Disney was overexposing his characters, which seems weird, but oh well. Even though the ride was cancelled, it did give Disney Imagineers some inspirations of doing the Haunted Mansion holiday that had Jack Skellington and the gang take over the Haunted Mansion every year during October through December, and was featured in Disneyland and Tokyo Disneyland. It's a bit of a shame that the original ride was scrapped. It looked awesome. It would have become a popular ride even though it has a weird location next to the Small World ride. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media. So this is Melting Man 234 signing out. Greetings, children of the night. I am Melting Man 234, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Sometimes when digging up these forgotten memories, you might dig up stuff beyond the grave. Good impersonation, ain't it? Well, since it's coming close to Halloween, I might as well just do a special Halloween episode for Forgotten Media, as we take a look at the Dark Castle games. Now, I know the Angry Video Game Nerd already reviewed the Genesis and CDI ports, but for me, I'm just going to talk about the history of Dark Castle, so let's start off with the first game, simply known as Dark Castle, that was created by Silicon Beach Software and was first released for the Macintosh computer around 1986. Then during 1987 through 1993, the game was ported to DOS, Commodore 64, Commodore Amiga, Atari ST, Apple II, GS, Genesis, CDI, and finally the MSX. The story for the game is that an evil Black Knight has terrorized a local town, and it's up to Prince Duncan to venture into his castle and defeat the Black Knight. The gameplay has you going around the castle in a platform style, fighting cyclops, bats, rats, stone soldiers, and other creepy things. The castle has 4 doors and 14 levels, and each of them have their own fancy theme. The character Duncan can be a bit clumsy as he gets dizzy or dies if he falls from a great height, and his first weapon he gets are rocks, which seems odd because Duncan's a prince, so shouldn't he brought along like a sword or mace or anything like that? Yeah, well, later in the game your rocks are upgraded to fireballs, and the shield protects you from any flying projectiles, which can be very useful. One thing to know about the Dark Castle games is that if you play it on the highest difficulty, you'll get to see the real ending. If you beat the Black Knight on Advanced Mode, which is the highest difficulty, he falls to his doom as Duncan does a victory dance. During its time, Dark Castle was a great game for the Macintosh. Of course, a lot of people say that it's garbage, mostly because of its Genesis and CDI ports and all that stuff were just lousy controls, but for me, I kind of see the Dark Castle as one of those games for like advanced gamers, and the game was a lot better on the Macintosh version before they butchered into other consoles, I think. In 1998, the game was later remade for its newer model of the Macintosh known as Color Dark Castle. It's the same as Dark Castle, except that it's in color, it has a save feature, it has 16 levels, and it contains a secret level that gives you a special bonus. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, why do they call it Color Dark Castle when the other ports had color? Well, that's because the first model of the Macintosh was only in black and white, and since with its newer model it was in color, it kind of made sense why it was called Color Dark Castle and something like that. The first time I heard that name, it sounded like something for the Game Boy Color. They also ported Dark Castle onto mobile phones in 2005, known as Dark Castle Mobile, and it's pretty much the same as Dark Castle with a few differences. Next up is Beyond Dark Castle, which is a sequel to Dark Castle and was made by Silicon Beach Software again, and was released in 1987 for the Macintosh, and was ported to the Apple II, GS, Commodore 64, and Commodore Amiga in 1989. The story is that after Prince Duncan defeated the Black Knight, Duncan discovers a new area in the castle and finds out the Black Knight is still alive, so he goes forth into the new section of the castle to defeat the Black Knight once and for all. In this game, you have to travel through the castle walls and collect 5 orbs, which will unlock the stage to battle the Black Knight. Gameplay is a bit similar to Dark Castle, with some new features such as new enemies, a helicopter backpack, collecting bombs for items, new weapons, a save feature, and an interesting Easter egg that if you play the game during Christmas or somewhere like that, it'll have the halls all decked out for its season. Just like the first game, you have to play it on the highest difficulty to watch the real ending. Once you defeat the Black Knight on advanced mode, he disappears and Duncan makes his way back out of the secret passage and does a little dance. Then suddenly, a ball of light strikes him and Duncan has become the new Black Knight, and the game ends with a pretty creepy cliffhanger. Overall, it's a pretty decent sequel during its time. A few years later, they announced in 2000 that a third Dark Castle was in the works, but it would take them almost 10 years to finish it, but they eventually made the third one, Return to Dark Castle, that was created by Z-Sculpt and Super Happy Fun Fun, and was released for the Macintosh, once again, in March 14th, 2008. The story takes place a few years after the events of Beyond Dark Castle, where a man named Bryant, who is a nephew of Duncan, has journeyed into Dark Castle and must find his father and defeat the reincarnation of the Black Knight. The game has you going around collecting items and 10 orbs to access the final battle with the Black Knight. The game has over 50 levels, as some of them are new and most of them are levels from both Dark Castle and Beyond Dark Castle, given massive upgrades with its graphics and such. So yeah, it's a bit like traveling down memory lane from Dark Castle and Beyond Dark Castle with a few interesting upgrades, mostly new music for the stages, which is pretty cool since the other Dark Castle games for the Mac didn't have music back then. The game also has the ability to equip weapons, the ability to use teleportation to send you back to the main hall, and a bunch of other stuff. It has been said that there was going to be a level editor, but it wasn't included when the game was released. Super Happy Fun Fun has said that the level editor will be coming soon, but who knows when it will be released. Just like the other games, it has a real ending if you play it on the highest difficulty. If you beat the game on easy, the Black Knight will just laugh and say, "Ha, you'll need to try harder than that for a real ending." So, once you beat the game on advanced mode and defeat the Black Knight, the armor flies off, revealing that Duncan, now an old man, who explains to his nephew that he defeated the Black Knight, and his armor took control over him, becoming the new Black Knight. But now the armor is looking for a new body to possess, and Duncan and Bryant rush out of the castle and find a ship near the castle. Before they return, Duncan takes his nephew to a place where he always wanted to go, and the game ends there. Since it left off in a cliffhanger, it's still debatable whether there's going to be a fourth Dark Castle game or not. But overall, Return to Dark Castle was challenging and pretty good at the same time. Nowadays the games are a bit hard to find, mostly all the different parts to Dark Castle and Beyond Dark Castle. Return to Dark Castle is a bit more of a fancy downloadable content, I think, so I don't think it isn't that hard to find. In closing, the Dark Castle series has a pretty interesting series with its Renaissance look, its feel, but the series is pretty cool in its own way, even with its highest difficulty and stuff. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media. This is Melting Man 234 signing off and wishing everyone a happy Halloween! Hey everyone, Melting Man 234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Today we'll be looking at another forgotten video game series known as Serious Sam, basically a first-person shooter running around blowing stuff up. The first game was created by Crotan and was released for the PC on March 1st, 2001. The game came with 3 episodes. One was the first encounter, The other was The Second Encounter, which is pretty much part 2, and not a sequel. And then there's Dark Island, which is more of a bonus feature, playing fan-made levels. The story of the game is plain simple. An evil overlord named Mattel has invaded Earth with his army of aliens, and Serious Sam must destroy them with his big-ass guns. Gameplay is a bit like a throwback to the old days of first-person shooters, with hidden areas full of treasures and the enemies come charging at you at full force. The game was known for featuring cooperative gameplay, which most first-person shooter games didn't have during the time, and a split-screen action supporting up to 4 players, which was a very rare feature during the time. The game's humor is pretty funny, such as crazy-looking enemies like headless suicide bombers screaming out loud, along with its breaking the fourth wall gags. There are also a few moments like when you kill a certain enemy, they explode into flowers. No idea how that works. Crow10 created their own engine for the game called the Serious Engine, which is designed to work with larger views and massive number of models. The engine was very advanced compared to other engines during its time. When the game was released, it was a success, earning several awards such as Game of the Year, Editor's Choice, Outstanding Achievement in Technology, and a Surprise of the Year. They also remade the first and second encounter for Windows PC and 360. They also made a few ports that combined both episodes in the Serious Sam Golden Edition. There was also an Xbox and PlayStation 2 port with their own features here and there, and a spin-off known as Serious Sam Advance, which was made for the Game Boy Advance. But overall, Serious Sam was a fun game for the PC. Next up is Serious Sam 2, that was made for the PC and was released on October 11, 2005. The game would later be ported for the Xbox console. Its story picks up right after where the first game left off, as Serious Sam is summoned by the Siron Great Council as they help Sam on his quest to defeat Mattel. They tell him that he must collect 5 pieces to form a medallion that can defeat Mattel, and so Sam goes off to various planets to collect the pieces and defeat Mattel. Its gameplay mostly consists of blowing up numerous enemies for certain purposes. The blood and gore has been improved in the sequel. It also has a variety of strange enemies like clockwork toy rhinos, suicidal clowns, zombies, stockbrokers with shotguns, and others, which makes the game have its own freak show. A lot of weapons from the first game come back, such as the Serious Bomb, rocket launcher, grenade launcher, and so on. One of the weapons that was introduced was the Claudovic Kakudos Vulgarius. Basically, it's a pair clutching a bomb that can fly towards enemies and eliminate them, kind of like your own personal Bomberman. Multiplayer returns from the previous game, which instead of playing as a single-player campaign together, this sequel goes beyond that, such as death matches and so on. When the game was in development, they upgraded the engine to the Serious Engine 2, and with it, they were able to add in a level editor for more fun. When the sequel was released, it did get a lot of positive reviews, but not much honor as the first game did. The most common criticism the game got was that it was less serious and more cartoony. With its first game, that had some jokes but still contained its seriousness, while the sequel is a bit more of the opposite. But either way, Serious Sam 2 is a pretty decent game. In closing, Serious Sam was a fun game where it was one of those blow stuff up games with its own style. It would seem like after this, Serious Sam would become nothing more than a forgotten memory. That is until I discovered this! Serious Sam 3, Before First Encounter. As the title says, the game takes place before the events of the first game, so technically since the game is a prequel, it shouldn't be called Serious Sam 3, but I have seen a few second sequels that act as prequels and so on. Crow Team returns to make it, and what makes the game interesting is that it's a game that's going to be released this year for the PC, PS3, and 360 around November 22nd, 2011. So I'm sure some people are excited to see it. It would be funny if there was a scene where Sam meets the Joker and he asks, "Why so serious, Sam?" Well, at least it's nice to know that Serious Sam is now becoming a trilogy. Out of all the stuff I've talked about on Forgotten Media, it seems like Serious Sam is one of the lucky few to get a new generation of fans. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media. So this is Melting Man 234 signing out. Hey everyone, MeltingMan234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Now, I'm sure some of you have seen my VideoNow episode, which was a fancy little handheld system that plays shows on the go. Well, while I was doing my research on it, I found a review that CN3614 made about the VideoNow. At the end, he mentioned a system called the Juice Box, saying that it's so bad that he wasn't going to review it. And so, I got real curious. I started researching on the device and found out why he didn't want to review it. So anyway, this is a juice box. Not to be confused with a actual juice box. The juice box is a video player that was made by Mattel and was released somewhere in 2004 for the holiday season. It was created by Steve Beck, who led an international engineering team in San Francisco, New York, and China, who created the juice box. The system is similar to the VideoNow, but different in its own way. It usually plays videos or MP3 playbacks. It takes 3 AAA batteries and lasts up to 6 hours. It has a play, pause, stop, and skip button along with a power switch, volume switch, headphones to plug in, and a place to charge it in, I think. Just like the VideoNow, the system plays certain TV shows, but with the juice box it has a 2.7-inch screen. The console comes with a MP3 starter kit, compressing software, a spare cartridge, a 32 megabyte SD card, and a SD card reader. So since it uses SD cards, you can watch photos or recorded footage on it. Kind of like how the Game Boy Micro had that similar feature where you can use SD cards in it. There were a couple of shows released for it, such as Codename Kids Next Door, Yu-Gi-Oh!, and others, as the system was aimed for kids who wanted to watch their favorite shows on the go. But the system didn't last very long. One common criticism was that the video quality was very poor, performing 6 frames per second, and the system entered into a crowded market during the time. It was pushed aside like trash, as the VideoNow and Game Boy Advance were still around and were much better. This was also the same time the Game Boy Advance released their line of Game Boy Advance videos. As the price for the juice box was originally $70, retailer stores were filled with massive amounts of the juice boxes that they probably cut down the price to make them cheaper and get rid of them. At least they didn't bury them in the middle of nowhere like a certain Atari game people dare not speak its name. I'm not sure when the console was discontinued, but I'll bet it didn't last very long, and when that happened it just vanished from existence. Nowadays the juice box isn't that hard to find. Mostly you'll find a lot of them on eBay for very cheap prices. If it's in a bundle of juice box related products, then it tends to be more expensive. When 2008 came around, the juice box was so cheap that it became a neat little device for hobbyists to experiment on, since the system uses a Linux-based operating system. Inventors and maybe even steampunk people have tinkered around with the system, making unique items out of it. Like, someone made a fancy picture frame out of it, and one made a funky-looking telephone with a screen on it, which is pretty cool. In closing, Mattel's juice box was trying to compete with its rivals but failed miserably and became a hunk of junk. Although it is a nice device to experiment on, making it better and just tweaking around with it. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing out. Hey everyone, Melting Man 234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Today we'll be looking at one of my favorite forgotten Sega characters, known as Vectorman. An interesting character who looks like he was from Balls 3D, but it's a good thing he didn't appear in that game. So anyway, let's start off with this first game, simply known as Vectorman, that was created by Blue Sky Software, and was released for the Sega Genesis on October 24th, 1995. In the year 2049, a group of mechanical creatures called Orbots have been built to clean up the Earth's pollution and littering. One day, an Orbot named Rastar is accidentally attached to a nuclear missile in his head, which corrupts with his mind and goes insane as he becomes Warhead, who declares himself ruler and sends his minions to attack the human population. And it's up to Vectorman to save the Earth and defeat Warhead. I wonder if that's actually going to happen in the year 2049. Vectorman's gameplay is a typical run-and-gun platforming game. Its graphics use pre-rendered 3D models, which makes the game have that computer-generated feel to it. It was pretty awesome back in the day. People have said that the graphics are similar to Donkey Kong Country, as they display graphics that the consoles weren't capable of during the time. Music in this game is pretty awesome, having that sweet techno beat. Vectorman has a variety of guns, from laser guns to spread guns and more. Vectorman can also collect a few power-ups that give him special abilities, such as becoming a drill, or bomb, or a vehicle. There are also televisions that are scattered around through levels that act as item boxes, whether it's the ability to morph into something, an extra 1-up, or some points. Who knows? You'll never know what you're going to get out of those things. Even though the enemies are pretty interesting, it seems like some of the bosses aren't that interesting. There's one area where you have to fight 3 different bosses, and one of them looks like Jaws from Sonic the Hedgehog on stilts. Another thing is that they sometimes tend to reuse the same levels and give them different textures and such. When the game was released, it was a critical and commercial success, as the game was nominated for Best Genesis Game of 1995. It was praised for its graphics, level design, and soundtrack, but its solid gameplay is what holds the game together. Overall, Vectorman was a great game. It was so great that it got its own sequel, Vectorman 2, as Blue Sky Software returns to make it, and was ported once again for the Genesis, and was released on November 15, 1996. After Vectorman defeated Warhead and saved the Earth, Vectorman takes his space shuttle for a spin, but then his shuttle is struck by a missile, and Vectorman parachutes his way down to the ground, where he must battle mutant insects and defeat the Black Widow Queen. The gameplay and graphics are the same as before, with a few modifications. Vectorman's voice is given more of a deeper voice instead of his normal robotic voice. Familiar power-ups from the first game come back, as well as some new ones like the Pulse Beam, Energy Shot, and Super Shot. There are new power-ups that are similar to animals, such as the Fire Ant and Shield Bug, and one of my favorites is the Rhino form, which makes you seem like you're invincible, charging into random enemies. The game has 22 levels that are divided into 7 parts, as some levels have a run-and-gun platform, some of them have a vehicle level, like a tank level, and then we have the boss levels. While the game was in production, Sega Channel held a contest that allowed artists to draw a form for Vectorman, and if they liked it, they would feature it in the game. 10 runner-up submitters won a copy of Vectorman 2 for their work. A man by the name of Josh Krebs was one of the lucky few winners to win the Vectorman Morph contest. The one thing about Vectorman 2 is that the difficulty level is more harder than the first game, but overall the sequel is pretty good. I have played both games and they are a lot of fun. During 2003, it was announced that a new Vectorman game was in the works even though the company Blue Sky Software was shut down in 2001. The game was going to be for the PlayStation 2, but unfortunately, the game was cancelled and never released. The game was going to try something new, but people were alienated by its new style from going from a creative and lighthearted run-and-gun platformer into another generic, overly serious third-person shooter. Not much is known for its story, whether it's going to be a continuation, a reboot, an alternate universe, who knows. It looks like you would run around in big open areas, shoot stuff, and carry things. This is what Vectorman was going to look like in the game. His design is very similar to Master Chief, and his voice was going to be in more of a higher pitch for some reason. Some say that when the criticism for the game was not that well received, they decided to pull the plug on it. I guess people were expecting it to be an actual Vectorman game, but instead we saw this, and come to think of it, it seems like the new Vectorman game is very similar to Halo. Since the first Halo game was already released during the time, could it possibly be that the new Vectorman was actually ripping off Halo? Well, anyway, when the third game was cancelled, people started to forget about Vectorman, and he pretty much bit the dust and was never seen again. As for his 2 only games, you can either find them for the Genesis, which are a little bit hard to find, or check out some of the video games that feature it. The 2 games have been ported to a few compilation games, such as Sonic Gems Collection, Sonic Genesis Collection, Sonic's Ultimate Genesis Collection, and Sega Genesis Classic Pack. The first Vectorman game was released for the Virtual Console on February 27, 2007, and I'm not sure if the sequel made it to the Virtual Console or not. I'll have to say, it's a bit of a shame that Vectorman wasn't featured in any of the Sega Superstar games. I would have loved to see him back in action. In closing, Vectorman is a more underrated character who doesn't get the respect he deserves. He appeared in 2 wonderful games, and I think it's about time he deserves a more proper second sequel. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing out. Hey everyone, Melting Man 234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Today we'll be looking at a fancy speedster known as Jackrabbit, an anthropomorphic rabbit who carries around a big laser blaster. The character was designed by Cliff Bleszinski, and was developed by Epic Mega Games, now going by the name of Epic Games, and became the mascot to the company back then. So let's start off with its first game, simply known as Jackrabbit. That was released for the MS-DOS, Windows, and Macintosh around July 30th, 1994. The story is more of a science fiction fantasy take on the tortoise and the hare story, as the story for this game is about rabbits and tortoises who have been at war with each other for over 3,000 years. An evil mastermind named Devon Shell has invaded the planet Caritas and kidnaps the Princess Eva Earlong, and it's up to Jazz along with his LFG-2000 to journey forth to defeat Devon and rescue Eva Earlong. The game is divided into 6 episodes, as each of them contain 3 planets, as every planet contains 2 levels. There are also secret and bonus levels that Jazz can enter, which he turns into another species of animals for the secret levels. Gameplay-wise, it's running and gunning platformer, and borrows several elements from Sonic the Hedgehog, such as the ability to speed through levels, springs, and the end goals. Some people think that Jazz Jackrabbit is a bit of a lame copy of Sonic the Hedgehog in a computer world, and I find that a little bit interesting. In my Cancel Sonic the Hedgehog games episode, I mentioned how they had plans of porting the first Sonic game to the Amiga and other old computer consoles. So, was there an interesting coincidence? Probably not. Jazz Jackrabbit was actually more inspired by another platformer game called Zool, and surprisingly enough, the character Zool makes a cameo in the Jazz Jackrabbit game. Maybe I'll talk more about Zool in the future of Forgotten Media. Jazz has his own unique moves, such as using his gun and getting power-ups, using his helicopter ears, and a few others. As for the items, some of them represent power-ups like upgrading your gun, speed boosts, carrots to regain your health and extra lives. The game utilizes a game engine called Open Jazz that was created by Alistair Thompson, if I pronounce that right, and the game utilizes 2 level editors. When Jazz Jackrabbit was first released, it received a lot of positive reviews, even though it didn't get much popularity to become a mascot of the PC consoles during the time. But it did create a decent amount of fans who liked the game, since there weren't that many good PC platformer games during the time. In 1995, Jazz Jackrabbit was declared Arcade Game of the Year, and received several versions. There's the original version, there's a shareware version, a Christmas version, a Macintosh version, a CD-ROM version with an Easter egg inside, an update to the Christmas version called Holiday Hair, a shareware version of Holiday Hair, and a CD-ROM version for the Windows 95. During the same year the game was released, several characters from the game such as Jazz, Eva, and Devin appear as unlockable characters in One Must Fall 2097. So anyway, the first Jazz game was pretty good during its time. Next up is its sequel, Jazz Jackrabbit 2, that was made for Microsoft Windows and Macintosh OS, and was released somewhere in 1998. The story takes place after the first game, as Jazz has been knighted by the king and queen for rescuing their daughter, Eva Earlong, and is able to marry her. During the wedding, Devin crashes into the party with his army and steals Eva's 12-carat diamond ring. Humiliated for not defeating him, Jazz is thrown into the dungeon, but manages to escape with the help of his brother, Spaz Jackrabbit. So the two rabbits head out to get the ring back and defeat Devin once again. The gameplay is like its predecessor with a few new things such as new enemies, new bosses, new power-ups, and so on. The cutscenes have been improved compared to its original, as the sequel is giving it more texture and detail, making it look better. The levels are usually race to the finish levels, and some of them have puzzle elements, and some of them are secret levels. There are a couple of pickups such as coins, gems, and fruit. If you get enough fruit, that'll activate Sugar Rush, making you invincible for a brief period of time. Jazz has his usual moves, while Spaz has his own moves. He can do a double jump and use the side kick, which is some fancy kicking ability. This is also the first Jazz game to feature a multiplayer feature, which is pretty interesting. When the game was released, it did very well for its time and got a couple of add-ons and upgrades. There's the Shareware Edition, there's Holiday Hair 98, which was a Christmas edition, there's the Secret Files, which introduces a new character named Lori Jackrabbit. She's Jazz's sister and was originally going to be Spaz's girlfriend, but the role was changed and has her own set of moves. We also made a shareware version of the Secret Files, and one more Christmas special called the Christmas Chronicles, which also features Lori. So yeah, the sequel was pretty good. During the times when the games were being released, they released a few comics that advertised for both games, as they are pretty interesting to look at, as they would usually make a comic to certain video games for advertisements, just like what the Archie Sonic comics are doing recently. There's this funny moment where Sonic makes a cameo in the first comic, demanding his lawyers. It seems like they were poking fun at this bit, as Jazz is similar to Sonic in a few ways. At least with Jazz, it makes sense because rabbits are fast and hedgehogs aren't that fast. Next up is an unreleased PC second sequel called Jazz Jackrabbit 3, sometimes known as Jazz Jackrabbit 3D. The story is that Eva and Jazz have settled down and have some kids now that Devin's out of the way. But their peaceful family is disturbed as Devin returns and kidnaps the children using a dimensional time machine to take them into a 3D alternate universe. So Jazz jumps into the 3D realm of gaming and goes off to save his kids. The game was going to be more of a third-person shooter with some platforming and adventuring elements, as well as some multiplayer action. The items and enemies are all made up of dreams, as Devin uses the kids' dreams to go after Jazz. No idea how that's gonna work. Spaz and Lori were also planned to be playable characters, which they could mean that they were going to have their own levels, or just be characters at the character select option. When the game was in production, Epic Games was unable to find a publisher to get the game going, and sadly, the game was cancelled in May of 2000 and was never seen again. It's a bit of a shame. It looked kinda cool. For a while, it would seem like Jazz Jackrabbit would become a forgotten character, until they decided to make one more game, Jazz Jackrabbit Advance, that was released for the Game Boy Advance somewhere in 2002. I actually wasn't going to feature this on Forgotten Media, but I decided to throw this one in as a bonus. At first, I thought this was somewhat of a remake/reboot, but it states that it continues the story from Jazz 2, as it shows Jazz on his final mission before retiring, as he visits a planet full of evil chameleons and its evil king, and manages to defeat them. His boss later tells him that a new evil named Dark Shell is going around causing damage, and so Jazz goes off to defeat the Dark Shell and save the galaxy. The gameplay is more of a toss-up between the two games from the past. Levels tend to be a bit shorter but offer some variations and puzzles, as there are 24 levels in total. It contains its supply of weapons and items, but the levels aren't stuffed with them like the other two. You can also collect wads of cash called space credits, which act as money to buy items and such. The game also features 11 multiplayer levels, as the levels were unlocked by playing certain single-player levels. When the game was released, it got more of a mixed reaction. Fans of the Jazz series were outraged with Jazz's new look, and that none of the familiar characters such as Eva, Lori, or Devin appear in the game. They even started a campaign called Fixers to Jackrabbit to make the company change Jazz back to normal, but obviously that didn't work. Also, the game isn't canon to the series, as this game wasn't made by Epic Games. Instead, it was made by a company called Jaleco Entertainment, if I pronounced that right. Epic Games licensed the game, but had nothing to do with it. I see Jazz Jackrabbit Advance very similar to the Mario and Zelda CDI games, as they were made by a totally different company, and the original company licensed the game, but had nothing to do with it. So after Jazz's sore comeback, people just started forgetting about him and just vanished from existence and was never seen again. Nowadays, the Jazz games are either easy to find or hard to find, depending on how rare or in good condition they are, while most of the special editions are very rare to find. In closing, Jazz Jackrabbit was a fun and interesting game series that should have lasted a bit longer. It would be nice if they could actually make a more proper second sequel, giving Jazz the respect he deserves and a new generation of fans. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing out. Hey everyone, Melting Man 234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. Today we'll be looking at the history of a forgotten and creepy-looking subject known as Nightmare Ned, a bizarre and strange idea that all started on a PC game that was developed by Creative Capers Entertainment and Disney Interactive Studios and was released in 1997. The story for the game is that Ned has gotten back from school, only to find out that his mother has taken his dad to work and taken his little sister Amy with her, and so he starts to enjoy himself alone in the house, eating sweets and playing video games. So much for calling a babysitter to watch Ned. Anyway, a lightning storm causes a power outage, and so Ned decides to head for bed, but Ned's fears causes him to enter into the dream world, where he must travel through 5 different areas and encounter 5 different shadow monsters to revert them to the people that are from Ned's world. The gameplay has you going through different levels that resemble Ned's fears, such as the graveyard, the attic, the school, the hospital, and the bathroom. Your only weapon is your yo-yo, which you can use to defeat ghouls and activate switches. Each area has a shadow monster residing, and after completing a certain task or defeating an enemy, the shadow creature will slowly reveal who it's resembling in Ned's world. The graphics are nothing special compared to today's standards, but back then in 1997 it was incredible. The art style is very macabre beyond belief, with its zombies, pipe cleaners, skeletons, and a whole bunch of other creepy things that go bump in the night. I'll have to say, for its art style, it's so dark and creepy that it feels like Tim Burton worked on this game. Music in this game is very eerie, but beautiful at the same time. There are also a few songs in the game which are pretty interesting. The game was pretty scary and sometimes tends to be a little bit gruesome, mostly the dentist level where you're inside a mouth and it's so detailed with its style it looks pretty disgusting. There's also a good and a bad ending to this game. You have 8 tries to return back to the main quilt map, and if you use them all up, then Ned will wake up still being afraid of everything. If you don't use up all your quills and beat the game, then Ned will wake up now brave as he conquered his fears. I actually remember seeing this game as part of an advertisement when I finally got my hands on a copy of Disney's Villain's Revenge a while back. Overall, the game is pretty decent, but it's very hard to find nowadays. With the game already made, it actually spawned a TV series, which was a dark comedy and adventure series
that was developed by Walt Disney Television Animation, created by Terry Shakespeare, Sue Shakespeare, and David Malina, and premiered on ABC on April 19, 1997. The episodes usually show Ned's daily problems like growing up, the dentist, and so on. Then we see him dive into the dream world to see Ned deal with them. Each episode has 2 shorts in one episode, kind of like how Dave the Barbarian had. For the main cast, there was Ned Needlemeyer, who's the 10-year-old boy who has pretty strange nightmares. His dad tries to help Ned get through his life, while his mother tries to understand his nightmares. And along the way, we get to see a lot of zany and strange creatures throughout the series. Every time Ned goes into the dream world, we see the screen spiral into different colors resembling Ned entering the dream world, as the episodes themselves are pretty crazy. One episode had Ned going through the times of growing up, one episode shows him being turned into a dog, one episode had Ned trying to save his baby teeth from the Tooth Fairy, and a couple of other strange and bizarre episodes. The show was dark, creepy, but very entertaining to watch. Sadly, it didn't last very long, as there are 2 reasons why the show got the axe. One was that the show ran over budget, and 2, parents complained that the show was too scary for kids. And so, with only 12 episodes made, the series was cancelled on August 9, 1997 and was never seen again. Because of its short life, none of the episodes were released onto home video to my knowledge. As for the internet, several episodes and clips of the other episodes can be found on YouTube. Even though it's some guy with a camera recording them off of his TV, this is your best chance at finding any surviving episodes. That is, unless you watched the series and recorded them on VHS back then. I one time found a website called Petition Online, and it pretty much has all these random petitions of like things that should be. And one of them happens to be people saying that they should bring Nightmare Ned onto DVD. And I would say that would be pretty interesting if they could do that, put all 12 episodes into one DVD. I'd sure like to see that happen. In closing, Nightmare Ned was a dark and entertaining show that seems to be a little bit underrated nowadays. I think they should bring it back and feature it on Disney Channel during the night and have it a PG rating and not a Y rating. Besides, there's nothing good on Disney Channel anymore except for Phineas and Ferb. I know how they say that kids are scared from the show and all that, but kids like to be scared sometimes. As Nostalgia Critic once said, if we didn't like being scared, then we wouldn't go out for trick-or-treating on Halloween, or watch any of the High School Musical films. Yeah, I know the last count was a little bit off, but you get the picture. I always wondered if James Rolfe, aka the Angry Video Game Nerd, watched the series or played the game or something like that. He is a nerd when it comes to scary films and such in real life. And I always wondered what happened to Ned after dealing with his nightmares and finally growing up. Maybe he decided to change his name to Freddy and become Freddy Krueger in the future. Yeah, I know that seems a little bit far-fetched, but I think that'd be cool, like, foreshadowing the character. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media. So this is Melty Man 234 signing out.